Thank you. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status or background. To read the full notice of your rights and protections, go to www.boston.org/MPO_non-DISCRIMINATION. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Others remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with the raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Betsy Harvey via the chat box at eharvey@ctps.org or 857-702-3701. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant, with exceptions, with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised section of 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Betsy Harvey of the MPO staff at eharvey@ctps.org or 857-702-3701. First item on the agenda is introductions. I'm David Muller, represent Secretary Gina Fiandaca here. Please call the roll.
Mass DOT seat 2.
I don't see John Bouchard yet.
I believe it's Marie Rose. So do you see Marie?
Yes, correct. Marie Rose representing Deputy Chief Engineer John Bouchard.
Thank you. Mass DOT highway.
John Romano here.
MBTA.
Good morning, this is Allie Clayman.
Massport. Okay, can come back.
Sorry, I got kicked off for a minute. Good morning, this is Allie Clayman representing General Manager Eng and the MBTA.
Thank you. Massport. I think I see Sarah Lee here, but I can come back. MAPC.
Good morning, Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Amira Patterson representing the MBTA Advisory Board.
Advisory Council.
Leonard Premi D, Leonard Diggins Advisory Council Chair here.
Okay. City of Boston BTD.
I do not see any representatives. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, I can come back. City of Boston BPDA.
Hey, Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA representing Mayor Wu in the City of Boston. I believe Matt Moran will be joining shortly from BTD.
Great, thank you. At-large city, City of Everett.
Morning, Jay Monty representing Mayor DiMaria in the City of Everett.
At-large city, City of Newton.
Good morning, I'm David Kosis representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
At-large town, Town of Arlington.
I don't see Claire Ricker.
Thank you. At-large town, Town of Brookline.
Good morning, Rob King representing Town Administrator Charles Carey, Town of Brookline.
Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning, Tom Bent representing the City of Somerville, Mayor Catiana Ballantyne in the Intercore.
Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
I do not see Austin Saganowitz.
Okay, Thank you. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Ms. Giambetti, representing Metro West Region and Mayor Sinsky.
North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
I do not see Darlene Nguyen or Dylan Six.
Okay. North Suburban Planning Council, Town of Burlington.
I do not see Melissa Tintakalis.
Okay. South Shore Coalition, Town of Hull.
Not seeing anyone from Hull either.
Great. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
I do not see Peter Pelletier.
Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Regional Chamber.
You see me. Good morning, Tom O'Rourke, from Town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Thank you. And our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Not seeing any representatives yet.
Okay, and Federal Transit Administration.
Also not seeing any representatives.
Okay. Well, that calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report. I don't have one at this time, so we'll go directly to Kagan for the executive director's report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome everybody. If we can go to the next slide, I'd like to start my report, next slide, with highlights of the MPO staff engagement activities. So first, we have two opportunities related to the Coordinated Human Services Transportation Plan. We are conducting a survey to collect information about the needs and priorities for human services transportation, which serves seniors and people with disabilities. And to do so, we are seeking input from both the transportation providers as well as the users of those services. So the link to the survey will be in the chat. And as we always request, board members in particular, please help us share this survey and other engagement activities broadly through your networks. In addition to the survey, we will be holding a workshop on the same topic, the Human Services Transportation Coordination, on April 27th from 9:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. The workshop will provide a forum for councils on aging, disability commissions, transit providers, and other stakeholders in this arena to discuss strategies and actions for improving the coordination and delivery of human services transportation. So on those items, please reach out to Stella Jordan, our Public Engagement Program Manager, if you would like more information about either the engagement activities or the plan itself. And then we also have another survey that is out to support the update of the MPO's bicycle and pedestrian count database. We're collecting feedback to help us improve the utility, the ease of use of that database. So please, again, help us share the survey with your networks. And for more information about the database update of the survey, please contact Casey Cooper, who's our Bicycle and Pedestrian Program Manager. Go to the next slide. So today's agenda has two action items for discussion. Those action items are a work scope for NTD work that we will be presenting, and then also Amendment 4 to the 23 to 27 TIP. And that will be a request for you to vote to release that for a 21-day public review period. Then we have two capital planning discussion topics. The first will be by Ethan LaPointe on the summary of the final federal fiscal year 24 to 28 TIP programming scenarios. And then we'll have an update from MassDOT and the MBTA on the selection process for highway and transit projects that are included in the state's capital investment plan. And just as a reminder to board members, that capital plan is statewide and inclusive of all of the funding sources for the state, whereas the TIP is typically inclusive of the federal funding sources. So they will talk about the relationship between these documents in that presentation as well. Then there will be two long-range transportation plan items. The first that we'll have on the agenda is a discussion of the long-range transportation plan project and programming scenarios, which have been developed based on the board, your updated policies since the last long-range plan. And Bradley Putnam, the interim LRTP manager, will be presenting on that. And then Tim Reardon from MAPC will be presenting on the final socioeconomic projections that we will be using for the long-range plan. The next slide, please. The next meeting, I have a few dates on here. The next MPO board meeting is scheduled in 1 week from now on April 20th. which we expect to be a really crucial meeting, as you will likely be asked to vote to release the federal fiscal year 24 to 28 TIP out for a 21-day public review. So hopefully board members can attend. But also please note that next week's MPO meeting will be followed by a UPWP meeting at 1 p.m. And then the following week on the 27th, we will not have an MPO meeting, but we will have an A&F committee meeting. I do believe that time for that meeting that you see on the slide is going to be updated to 10 a.m. So please keep an eye on the MPO calendar to confirm if you would like to attend. And then in May, I just wanted to mention that we expect to be back to the first and third Thursdays in May for board meetings, preceded at 9 a.m. by A&F committee meetings. And that, Mr. Chair, is all I have. If anyone has questions.
Thank you, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan? Seeing none, next item on the agenda is public comment. If you'd like to make a comment at this time, please raise your hand. Eric Johnson.
Hi, thank you very much. Eric Johnson. I'm the city engineer for the city of Framingham. I'll just take a couple minutes to speak to you about project 606-109. That's the intersection improvements at Route 126, and 135, MBTA and CSX Railroad. This project is on the long-range transportation plan and listed under the draft destination 2050 universe of projects, as well as the LRTP, relevant Mass DOT Project Review Committee approved projects in your background material under agenda item number 12. This is a critical project for Framingham and the region as it dramatically increases the capacity of routes 135 and 126. These are principal arterials that serve the region and are greatly impacted by the immediately adjacent railroad tracks that serve the Worcester commuter rail as well as significant freight traffic. The rail crossing is an integral component of this intersection and forced between 60 and 70 preemptions via gate closures on weekdays. These closures average between 2.5 and 3 hours of total closure each day. So when you add that to the regular road closures at that intersection for the 135 and 126, we're looking at 14 to 15 hours of closure each day for the most critical north-south corridor throughout the city of Framingham, connecting Ashland and on north. Traffic counts are around 25,000 vehicles per day just for that one road. Now, unlike other grade crossings, the closure time at this intersection is greatly exacerbated by the fact that the Framingham commuter rail stop is one of the busiest in the MBTA commuter rail system and only 500 feet from this roadway intersection. Gate closures are particularly lengthy as trains are constantly slowing down or speeding up as they cross this road. And it's important to note that every commuter rail on this line stops at this intersection, even the express lines. And of course, commuter rail traffic being what it is, it peaks at morning and evening peak hours, just like vehicular traffic. And finally, on the MBTA, they've made it clear that they intend to increase rail traffic and usage of this commuter rail, further gridlocking this critical intersection. But even closer than the rail stop is actually the CSX freight yard. The spur is only 50 feet from this intersection, so large freight trains enter that yard and cause lengthy gate closures, averaging 10 to 20 minutes in the middle of the day, at least once a week. And while this intersection is clearly critical to the regional area, I think there's some local considerations. The city has passed a transportation-oriented development zoning, which has allowed over 1,000 new housing units and to be approved and constructed just within the last few years. It's also within an environmental justice area that's classified environmental justice for all three categories: minority, income, and English isolation. Further gridlocking this traffic and not improving this intersection will only impact this disadvantaged neighborhoods. So that's my statement. I thank you for this time in this matter. I look forward to agenda item number 12. I'm around for questions and people can reach out to me anytime. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Next, Miguel Perez Luna.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for letting me speak here. My name is Miguel Perez Luna, and I'm a transportation planner for the city of Cambridge. And I'm speaking today in support of the proposed bike share support program to be included in Destination 2050. As I think we all know, Blue Bikes has proven to be wildly popular, and it continues to grow every year with a high demand. And meeting this demand has been challenging, especially since many people rely on Blue Bikes as complementary transit to the MBTA. And so the demand continues to grow with that. This support program would help the 13 Blue Bikes communities to know what the available resources are as they each plan the expansion of their program and the replacement of their outdated equipment for some of the communities that have had the system for over 10 years now. It would also be particularly helpful for the communities who are new to the system to help reach communities that need more access to public transportation options who are further away from the MBTA. Expanding Blue Bikes does meet the state, region, community goals of addressing climate change, reducing reliance on single occupancy vehicles, supporting public health through active transportation, and it would help the long-term sustainability of this crucial system. We've seen the importance of having to plan and budget for state of good repair, and this dedicated source would help us with that. Lastly, it would just make the grant process smoother and more efficient if we knew what we could and couldn't get through grants, such as the Community Connections Grant, for example, which doesn't let us replace old equipment. It would just help us streamline procuring the equipment that we need to make the system successful. So thank you. That's all I wanted to share today.
Thank you, Mr. Perez Luna. Next, Jim Malloy. You're still muted.
There, I should be off mute now.
Yeah, you're good.
Good. So I'm Jim Malloy. I'm the town manager for the town of Lexington. And I'm here today to talk on the Route 4 and 225 Bedford Street, Hartwell Avenue major infrastructure project that is currently on the MPO's long-range plan, Destination 2040. With me today, we have Patricia Domingan from BHB, who is one of our consulting engineers, our assistant town engineer, Ross Morrow, and our assistant town planning director, Sheila Page, as well as our state representative, Michelle Sicolo, who will also be, I think, speaking later in the meeting. This is a complete street major infrastructure project which addresses traffic flow, safety, and pedestrian bicycle needs in the corridor. The project reconstructs portions of Bedford Street, which is Route 4 and 225, Hartwell Avenue and Wood Street to accommodate pedestrians, bicycles, and transit, provide a direct connection to the Minuteman Bikeway, and facilitate traffic flow between I-95, Route 128, and the employment centers along the corridor, such as Lincoln Labs and Hanscom's Air Force Base. Project will also reconstruct the I-95 ramps. Project scope has been updated to include the full interchange of Route 4 and 225 and I-95 to identify potential capacity improvements. Bedford Street, Hartwell Avenue, and Wood Street is a main commuter route and the gateway to Hanscom Airfield, Lincoln Labs, the town of Bedford, and Hartwell Avenue businesses. Lexington's Innovation District aims to create an active district with employment centers, multifamily housing, restaurants, retail, recreation, all with the Minuteman Bikeway intersecting the district. This Bedford Hartwell Complete Street project is essentially to ensure that residents, employers, and employees can get safely and efficiently around the district and through the district on foot, by bike, by bus, or by car. Since the last time we gave an update to the MPO, in 2019, our town meeting appropriated $1.5 million to develop the 25% design plan, which is underway by VHB. In 2020, town meeting voted to substantially increase the allowed density to attract biolab and office businesses to the Hartwell Avenue Business District. Since then, 2 buildings have been permitted, a 6-story lab building on Hartwell Avenue and a 6-story lab building on Bedford Street, which is currently under construction. At our annual town meeting in 2023, we just approved last night multifamily zoning under the new MBTA zoning in the district. Having the multifamily zoning will round out the uses to create a vibrant community where people can live, work, and play. Also, during the 2023 town meeting, which because it's Lexington, it's still going on. We've through 8 nights, but we're still going strong. We're also considering an additional appropriation of $1.75 million to bring the design to 75%. We also plan to ask for another $1.75 million to complete the project design and begin construction. It is imperative that this project remain on the long-range plan, as it provides the residents of Lexington the assurance that their $5 million design investment will eventually have a payoff for the improvements that we're seeking. In all, total Lexington will have invested over $13 million to bring the project to be construction ready. We've approved $7 million for the McGuire Hartwell intersection and bridge replacement. The construction funding has previously been approved by town meeting. We've approved $1 million for Hartwell Avenue's water main replacement project, completed in anticipation of the reconstruction projects that was done beforehand. We've made additional investments, including landscaping, bus stops, and improved pedestrian crossings, as well as a hawk crossing to achieve necessary pedestrian safety goals ahead of this project. Sheila Page, our assistant planning director, did send out a more detailed list of activities since the last update. I believe she sent it last night to the MPO members. Project is important because it includes the I-95-128 interchange, which connects Bedford, Carlisle, Westford, and Billerica to the interstate. This is a regionally significant project that belongs on the long-range transportation plan. Economic and residential growth has been hindered by high congestion, driver confusion, dangerous pedestrian crossings that inhibit MBTA ridership, and alternate forms of transportation. There is a top crash cluster at the intersection of Bedford and Eldridge Street. Although most people around here would say that the jug handle to enter the Hartwell Avenue Business District is actually the most confusing and dangerous to navigate. Reconstructing the Bedford-Hartwell intersection and adding pedestrian, bicycle, and transit facilities will improve safety. It'll fix choke points, add capacity, and promote healthy transportation and clean air by expanding our existing pedestrian bicycle network, providing safe pedestrian crossings and safe bus stops, and improving access to the Minuteman Bikeway. This project aligns with the MPO's goals of safety, capacity management, and mobility, clean air, and economic vitality. We're asking that the MPO support this project by keeping it on the Destination 2050 long-range plan during the fiscal 29 through 33 funding band, and later as it moves through the TIP process. Thank you very much. And like I said, we have other staff here that if there are questions that they'll be able to respond to any questions the MPO has. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Malloy. Other comments this time? Seeing none, during the meeting, if you'd like to comment, please raise your hand and we will try to call on you. Next item on the agenda is committee chairs reports. Are there any? Derek Cravat.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to let everybody know that the Unified Planning Work Program Committee will be meeting next Thursday, April 20th at 1 p.m. At that time, we'll see the results of the ranking survey that was distributed, asking members to rank their preferences for UPWP studies for fiscal year 2024 and hear any other ideas that folks have for studies. So that's all. Just wanted to plug that meeting next Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Any other committee chair reports at this time? Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is the Regional Transportation Council Advisory Council report. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. So yesterday we met and we had a nice long conversation about that UPWP universe of 18 studies. And also Ethan LaPointe gave us a nice preview of the final scenario in the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next item is the action item for the March 9th minutes. Before we take them up, I'd like to note for the record that Melissa Tintaklis, Sarah Lee, and Matt Moran have entered the meeting. So please call on them when we call the roll. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the minutes of March 9th? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Eric Barassa.
This is Eric Barassa. I'll make a motion to approve the March 9th MPO meeting minutes.
Is there a second? Amira Patterson.
I will second that motion, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions? Seeing none, please call the roll.
David Muller,
Yes.
Marie Rose,
Marie Rose, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Allie Clayman,
Allie Clayman, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Amira Patterson,
Amira Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Matthew Moran,
Matt Moran, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kosis,
David Kosis, yes.
Rob King,
Rob King, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tantakis,
Melissa Tantakis, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Okay, that calls the roll. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is a work scope for the MBTA State Fiscal Year 2024 National Transit Database. Bradley Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. For my first presentation today, I'd like to present to you a work program for MBTA State Fiscal Year 2024 National Transit Database. MPO staff have been assisting the MBTA with their annual submissions to the National Transit Database for many years, and this work scope represents a continuation of that work. The cost of this work scope is $205,000, and the MBTA will pay for this project. The project is proposed to run for 18 months from July 1st, 2023 to December 31st, 2024. The purpose of the project is to collect and analyze data for the MBTA about transit ridership in order to help them make their required annual submission to the National Transit Database. This project has many components. One is surveys of passengers on heavy and light rail modes. That data are used to determine average passenger miles traveled and links between modes. Another aspect is observations at fare gates and observations on board light rail vehicles to estimate how many passengers use or do not use the fare collection equipment when they board those vehicles or pass through fare gates. Another component is counting passengers on board buses to verify data from the MBTA's automatic passenger counters on its bus modes. And another component is bus passenger counts on MBTA purchased service bus routes that do not have automatic passenger counters, which are bus routes 714 and 716, and to collect data to estimate ridership on shuttle buses that are substituting for MBTA rail service. I'd be happy to answer any questions that members have on this scope. Otherwise, I'd like to ask you please vote to approve it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Bradley. Any questions for Bradley? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve the work scope as presented today? Please state your name for the record when making the motion. Lynn Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, happy to make the motion to approve the work scope.
Thank you. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, I'll second that.
Motion having been made and seconded, please call the roll.
David Muller,
Yes.
Marie Rose,
Marie Rose, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Ally Clayman,
Ally Clayman, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Mira Patterson,
Mayor Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Matt Moran,
Matt Moran, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes. Sorry. Thank you.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kosis,
David Kosis, yes.
Rob King,
Rob King, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tantakis,
Melissa Tantakis, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Great. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is an action item for amendment number 4 to the FY23 to 27 tip. Ethan Lapointe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everybody. I am Ethan Lapointe, the Transportation Improvement Program Manager. This presentation will cover Amendment 4 to the current 2023 to 27 tip. If we can go on to the next slide, just to summarize what is contained within Amendment 4, for the federal fiscal year 2023 program, Amendment 4 includes the programming of a SMART grant award for Metro West RTA, 2 cost increases for highway projects within MassDOT's program, some updates to the MBTA's capital programs to reflect some of the changes made as part of its draft capital investment plan, and also the programming of 3 new grant awards received by the MBTA since Amendment 1 in October of last year. Going on to the next slide, just to look at some of these amendment changes by program, and starting off with the Metro West RTA's SMART Grant Award. A SMART Grant is a new USDOT grant provided under the bipartisan infrastructure law, which stands for Strengthening Mobility and Revolutionizing Transportation. It's meant to advance smart technologies and systems. This Metro West grant included here is one of 4 grants received by the state of Massachusetts during the federal fiscal year 2022 round. The other 3 recipients were 2 awards by MassDOT and 1 award by the city of Brockton. In this case for Metro West received $985,000 to install solar power and battery banks at its on-site blending facility to power the conversion towards an electric fleet for Metro West RTA and work towards establishing a smart grid. The project itself being called BEST for blending energy and sustainable storage technology. Going on to the highway projects on the next slide, there are 2 changes here. Next slide up, please. Thank you. Going on to the highway projects here, there are 2 highway projects included within Amendment 4. The first being funded by MassDOT as a state highway project, and the second being a regional target funded project. Both of these are cost increases resulting from recent design submissions on the contracts. The first being for Wilmington's bridge replacement project. This bridge being the one that carries Route 38 Main Street over the Boston and Maine Railroad. The budget for this project is currently programmed at $9.2 million, increasing up to $12.4 million, a $3.2 million increase resulting from a 100% design submission. The second project being the regional target funded project in federal fiscal year 2023. So this doesn't immediately have any bearing on the upcoming 24 to 28 TIP, is Winthrop's reconstruction and related work along Winthrop Street and the Revere Street corridor. This project is currently budgeted at approximately $6.8 million, increasing up to about $7.6 million, an increase of about $787,655. On March 17th, this project reached the plan specifications and estimates, or PS&E stage of its development cycle, and its budget is being revised to reflect that increased cost before it can be advertised for construction. Moving on to the bulk of Amendment 4 in terms of numbers here, we're starting off with the MBTA's capital investment program changes. These slides show the deltas between what was approved by the board as part of Amendment 1 for the programs and what is being requested here. The total final figures for this presentation can be found as attachments on the MPO calendar, showing where the final numbers are for the programs. Starting off with federal Section 5307 funding. These funds are urban fund, is a classification of Federal Transit Administration funding intended for use in urban areas for capital and operational efforts, including planning, studies, repairs, bus maintenance, and other uses. The total change for the MBTA's bridge and tunnel program is $42.1 million of increased funding. The second for the revenue vehicle program is a net decrease of $129.3 million. The next being an increase of $46.8 million for the signal systems and upgrade program, and a $35.2 million increase for the stations and facilities program. To note here, what these changes are being driven by are some of the updated figures contained within the capital investment plan, and also in light of some recalculations of funding availability under the bipartisan infrastructure law. Moreover, some of the awards of some of the MBTA grants, which I will get to at the end of this presentation, have freed up funding availability to program additional new projects in the future, as funding for those projects that grants were received for is now being offset by the grant. More on that later. On the next slide, to talk about another funding source, we have the same 4 programs, this time for Section 5337 funding. This funding is used similarly for operations and capital efforts, and also other forms of investments. This includes a $34.1 million decrease to bridge and tunnel, a $58.2 million increase to revenue vehicles, a $26.7 million increase to signal systems and upgrades, and a $33.9 million decrease to the stations and facilities program. And for the last one of the Section 5330 funding categories here, on the next slide, we have Section 5339. These are generally used, this funding is generally used again for other forms of operational planning and study efforts, including other uses, capital investments. This is another one of the bipartisan infrastructure law adjustments changes, again to the bridge and tunnel program, for a net decrease of $1.1 million across federal fiscal years 2023 through 2027, based on apportionments of funds under the BIL. Moving on to some of the more individual project line items for other forms of federal funding, the 5 projects that are shown here are receiving other kinds of federal funding that are outside of the 5307, 5337, and 5339 funds. The first being the Linway Multimodal Corridor Project. This project is being removed from the MBTA's CIP, and within this tip, because the project is being moved away from the MBTA's side for delivery to MassDOT's. So this results in a net decrease of $20.25 million, but this project isn't going anywhere. It's simply moving over to MassDOT's balance such that it may be executed by them. Moreover, with regard to the scenarios, these next 4 items are pending further discussion at my next presentation on the federal 24 to 28 tip. These are tentative adjustments to reflect changes made by MPO funding for 4 different MBTA projects. The first being the addition of additional funding in federal fiscal year 2024 for Columbus Avenue bus lanes phase 2. Again, this is just the federal funding component, not the full, including 20% match component. That is at $9.4 million of increase in 24. The defunding of the Forest Hills Station project is reflected at $5.1 million in reduction in federal fiscal year 24. Jackson Square being increased by 11 million in 24 and based on the scenarios being presented. And lastly, rail transformation early action being increased by $4.84 million in 2024. Moving on to the next slide, there's then for another interesting funding source, the MBTA's RRIF and TIFIA financing program, RRIF standing for, if we could just go back one slide. Thank you. The Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Program, with TIFIA standing for Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, which is funding from the United States Department of Transportation. TIFIA is a financing program that is offered through USDOT that provides capital assistance through effectively a loan and credit assistance for large-scale surface transportation projects, including for transit agencies and other railroad companies. In this case, the TIFIA financing line item within the MBTA's program is being increased by $22.5 million in both fiscal years 26 and 7 for a total change of $45 million across all fiscal years to reflect the MBTA's pursuit of additional financing for further out capital costs. On that note of aggressively pursuing additional funding, on the next slide, we can talk about 3 grant opportunities that the MBTA was able to successfully receive for various projects within the Boston region. The first is a grant received through FTA's All Stations Accessibility Program for the Symphony Station Access Improvements. This project is a new project to the tip that will modernize Symphony Station with 4 new elevators, step-free paths, accessible bathrooms, improved wayfinding, and raised boarding platforms. The purpose of these grants generally is to take transit stations throughout a transit systems network that may not be ADA compliant and providing the capital funding necessary to achieve further compliance with Americans with Disabilities Act standards. The next project is the Hingham Ferry Dock modification, the recipient of a $6.6 million grant through the FTA's Passenger Ferry Grant Program to improve the capacity of MBTA ferry service at the Hingham Dock and also improve the state of good repair and therefore resiliency of the Hingham Ferry Dock against extreme weather events and climate change. And last but not least for this amendment is a $7 million earmark from Congress, the House, as part of the federal fiscal year 2023 appropriations for the Newtonville, West Newton, and Auburndale commuter rail stations, which will go towards a larger capital project that would fund new stairs, ramps, elevators, platforms, canopies, benches, and bicycle storage facilities at these 3 MBTA commuter rail locations in Newton. With all of those changes in mind, on the next slide, staff are requesting that the board votes to release Amendment 4 for a 21-day public comment. This public comment period would span from April 14th to May 5th, 2023. And I'm happy to open the floor of discussion for that.
Thank you, Ethan. Are there questions? Eric Barassa.
Thank you, Ethan. That was very good. Good explanation. A lot of changes here. I have a question about the Newton, the 3 Newton commuter rail stations. The 7 million is an earmark, and is that being I know that the cost of those improvements is much greater than that. Is the full cost funded in the MBTA CIP? Maybe that's a question for Ally.
I can take that one.
Oh, hi.
Hi. So the Newton commuter rail stations remain funded just through design in the MBTA CIP right now, and this additional funds will support the project, but it is not currently funded for construction.
So this advances the design of it, or this starts to put money in for construction, and then hopefully more money will be identified?
This is additional funds than the design, yes.
Oh, this is additional just for design.
This is additional into above what we have already programmed for design of the stations.
But I think his question is this money going to be spent on construction, or are we going to spend it on design?
And I do not have a distinct answer for that right now. I believe they are required to be spent on construction.
Okay. I guess I'm trying to get at, just a better understanding if the full amount is programmed somewhere else or committed to, because I know
It's not.
it's not. Okay, it's not. Okay, I know it's been a long desire for the city to want to see these improvements, but I think I understand it. Thank you, Jillian.
Yep.
Other questions? Seeing and hearing none, can we get a motion and a second to release this for a 21-day public process? Please state your name for the record. Eric Barassa.
Yeah, Eric Barassa with MAPC. I make a motion to release Amendment 4 for public comment period.
Thank you. Amira Patterson.
Amira Patterson from the MBTA Advisory Board. I second that motion.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
David Muller,
Yes.
Marie Rose,
Yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Ally Clayman,
Ally Kleinman, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Amira Patterson,
Amira Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Matt Moran,
Matt Moran, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Rob King,
Rob King, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tintakoulis,
Melissa Tintakoulis, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is a summary of the final FY 24-28 tip programming scenario. Ethan LaPointe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So moving on to the development of the new federal fiscal years 2024 to 28 tip. The purpose of this presentation will be to cover some adjustments between April 13th being this meeting and what was initially presented to the board at the March 30th MPO meeting, just to reflect some updates. Today's presentation will also incorporate some commentary regarding the receipt of several public comments that have been received to staff since the March 30th MPO board meeting. And the adjustments that will be discussed as part of this presentation include a discussion and presentation on project inflation adjustments with regard to some of the highway line items included in this scenario, MBTA cost adjustments to factor in additional match and how that counts against regional target funding for the scenarios. And lastly, a cost increase on a highway project that has come in after the March 30th meeting for project 605-743 on South Main Street and High Street in Ipswich. And then we'll conclude just with discussion with regard to what action should be taken going forward with regard to adjusting this scenario. Moving on to the next slide, in advance of this presentation, an amended version of the TIP final scenario table was provided to the board to not only reflect some of the amendments made as a result of the March 30th meeting towards initially selected scenario 5, but also the incorporation of financial and cost adjustments for inflation factors year by year for adjusted total federal participating costs. More on that later. On the next slide, just to begin covering start off with the public comments received since the March 30th MPO board meeting. Staff received 2 comments directly. The first being a comment received from a resident in Medford in support of Medford's Blue Bikes expansion project, bike share investments in general within the city of Medford, and complete streets investment programs, which staff passed along to staff at the city of Medford. The second comment was directed towards a project not currently programmed in the 23-27 TIP, but was included in prior TIPs as it is currently in active construction. This was a comment from a resident in Acton concerned about damage on an ongoing active construction project for the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail over Route 2 in Acton, where there was damage observed on the superstructure of a bridge currently in construction, slated for completion in July of 2023. Those concerns were passed off to MassDOT Highway District staff and then towards the resident engineer on the project, such that the damage can be addressed before the completion of the contract. Not shown on this slide is a third letter that was received by staff yesterday from the city of Boston, expressing support for the LRTP's inclusion of a bike share support line item in the amount of $5 million a year, starting in federal fiscal year 2029, relevant to this scenario discussion, as bike share support funding will also commence under scenario 5 with amendments, starting at $1 million in federal fiscal year 2025, continuing into 2026, and elevating up to $2 million in federal fiscal years 27 and 8. This funding being to support state of good repair improvements to the existing bike share network and make expansion beyond the current network more feasible for additional municipalities. With that, that takes us into the next slide, just to cover TIP scenario inflation adjustments. As a result of discussions from board March 30th MPO board meeting, there were several amendments made into scenario 5 as was presented to the board. These amendments included the escalation of the project design pilot in federal fiscal year 2025, up from a $1.5 million pilot program to a $4 million pilot program, and the addition of $8.6 million of funding into federal fiscal year 2027 for the Rutherford Avenue project. That said, what that discussion and what the presentation that staff made on March 30th did not account for was the totality of inflation contingency necessary to be baked into each individual project in that scenario. After accounting for the additional inflation contingency for projects, which was not accounted at that March 30th meeting, the new remaining balances of unprogrammed funding in federal fiscal years 2024 through 28 are as follows: $7.9 million of unprogrammed funding in 24, $1.5 million approximately in 2025, $618,446 in fiscal year 2026. In 2027, $2.2 million. In 2028, $8.2 million for a total unprogrammed funding amount of approximately $20.4 million, or about 3% of all funding across the TIP. With regard to contingency, the most important year generally to hold contingency funding is the most immediate one, being federal fiscal year 2024, as that is when most projects will see maturing statuses in their design progress, and therefore the potential for cost increases, and TIPs are subject to change, so such when the 2025 to 29 TIP development begins, there may be further changes about a year from now. Moving on to the next slide to explain what this inflation adjustment that I mentioned is, and why this was not accounted for in that initial scenario presentation. There are 2 figures for a project's estimated cost. The first being a total federal participating cost, which reflects a project's cost in first year dollars, in this case being federal fiscal year 2024. Those funding amounts were the funding amounts provided to the MPO board at the March 30th meeting and did not incorporate the adjustments required by an adjusted TFPC. An adjusted TFPC takes a total federal participating cost and bakes in a 4% increase per year for that project, such that if a project is estimated at $10 million in federal fiscal year 2024, but is moved out to federal fiscal year 2026, it can be adjusted accordingly to bake in that 4% per year inflation contingency factor. The outcome of this on the next slide is that because inflation was not fully included in that scenario, adjustments reduced the amount of unprogrammed funding from the initial $41.4 million in that approved scenario down to $20.3 million in that new scenario. That said, TFPCs, especially in those outer years of the TIP, namely 2026 to 2028, will be subject to change, and federal fiscal year 2024 was unchanged from this adjustment. The total number of projects and also the scopes of work as they were approved in that scenario also is unchanged. That said, at the end of this presentation, there will be a discussion requesting some action for changes to the scenario, which, if we go on to the next slide, is the result of some discussion with regard to MBTA project cost adjustments. The three MBTA projects that were incorporated within scenario 5 with amendments were not inclusive of the MBTA's matching funds, these matching funds which count against the MPO's unprogrammed balances. When accounting for unprogrammed balances on these three projects, the effective cost of the project against the MPO's regional target funding increased. Starting off with Columbus Avenue Phase 2, which is currently programmed for $9.4 million, but would need to be escalated to $11.7 million. Next one being Jackson Square Station Accessibility Project, which would increase from $21 million of just the federal amount up to $26.3 million to be inclusive of the $5,250,000 of necessary 20% match on this funding. In addition, there is also the Rail Transformation Early Action item, currently funded at $11.2 million, again, only the federal amount, but would need to be escalated by an additional $2.8 million up to $14 million to be inclusive of all funding. Moving on to the next slide, there are some proposed actions here and options moving forward with regard to what should be done for these MBTA projects. The first option maintains project funding levels. In order to maintain the current funding levels or needs of these three projects, first, the federal fiscal year 2025 transit modernization set-aside line item would be reduced from its current 25 amount of $6.5 million down to $2 million. The end result being that such when the transit modernization funding investment program opens up this coming fall, there would be less money in the set-aside for applicants to apply for, but applicants that would be coming from regional transit authorities or municipalities would be prioritized for that remaining amount. There would be no changes besides increasing the amount of funding for match factored in for the Jackson Square Station Accessibility Project, Rail Transformation Project, or Columbus Avenue Bus Lanes Project. Effectively, the projects would be fully funded in their entirety and would now be inclusive of state match. The other primary impact of option 1 is that it does reduce the amount of regional target balance carried in those years, reducing down from $7.9 million in federal fiscal year 2024 to $2.8 million in federal fiscal year 2024, and in 25 reducing from $1.95 million down to $1.2 million in federal fiscal year 2025. Excuse me. Moving on to the next slide, option 2 recommends a reduction in the Rail Transformation Project line item. Just to reiterate what these three projects are and what the scopes of work being discussed are, the Jackson Square Station Accessibility Project is a project that would be funded in full by the MPO and is currently unfunded in the MBTA CIP. The Rail Transformation Early Action Line Items project is a project that is funded partially as a general early action rail transformation program within the MBTA CIP in the amount of approximately $18.9 million. The line items being reflected and addressed as part of this project could not be included within the CIP as they were unfunded, but this line item includes improvements at multiple locations. Therefore, The funding reduction down to $6.05 million would still fund the additional signal and track improvements at the Wilbur interlocking near Woburn Station as part of this line item, but would not fund the improvements to the turn track at Reading Station, accomplishing some of the objectives of this project. Moreover, the third project, the Columbus Avenue Bus Lanes Phase 2 project, is an additive request that would fund additional multimodal connectivity between Columbus Avenue's extension from Jackson Square down to Ruggles for dedicated bus lanes into the 3 MBTA Orange Line stations there, being Jackson Square, Roxbury Crossing, and Ruggles. This funding is additive to existing MPO contributions, not only to phase 1 of the project, but also contributions from last year to phase 2, effectively meaning this contribution is necessary to see the entirety of the project come to fruition. That said, with option 2, with the reduction of rail transformation, it results in the same reduction for the transit modernization set aside, down from $6.5 million in federal fiscal year 2025 to $2 million in that fiscal year. That said, unlike option 1, the reduction of the rail transformation project increases the amount of remaining regional target funding balance in federal fiscal years 24 and 5, increasing funding balance in federal fiscal year 24 by $1.55 million and in federal fiscal year 2025 by $500,000, bringing them up to $9.5 million in 24 and approximately $2.5 million in federal fiscal year 2025. As stated on that slide, if we move on to the next one, the Jackson Square Station Accessibility Project is currently not funded in the MBTA's capital investment plan and would not be funded without the full MPO contribution. Columbus Avenue's phase 2, this contribution being Columbus Avenue phase 2 being an investment that builds upon an existing $14.8 million contribution by the MPO, and also the third rail transformation project currently being funded in the MBTA CIP for other improvements as part of this rail transformation initiative, and the MPO's funding here being additive to incorporate additional improvements that were not factored into the initial CIP. And moving on for some considerations regarding the federal fiscal year 2025 transit modernization program, any remaining funding in transit modernization, that $2 million, would prioritize applications from RTAs, and the application round for that funding program for federal fiscal year 2025 will commence this fall, namely November of 2023. So it's coming fairly imminently. Moving on to the next slide, there is the aforementioned project adjustment for Ipswich's resurfacing and related work on Central and South Main Street project. To explain what drove this change, an updated 25% design submission was received by MassDOT on March 29th that highlighted this cost increase. The current scenario for this project programmed an adjusted TFPC initially of about $5.7 million in federal fiscal year 2026. However, with the updated design submission, the new estimated cost for this project is $11.7 million. There is insufficient regional target balance in federal fiscal year 2026 to support the cost increase for this project. The recommendation staff are making for this project, requesting MPO consideration and discussion around, next slide, is to fund this project across 2 federal fiscal years. By funding the additional cost on this project in federal fiscal year 2027, there would be no impact to the regional target balance in federal fiscal year 2026. However, there is also currently insufficient regional target funding to accommodate this project's extension into federal fiscal year 2027. In discussions with MassDOT staff, including the project manager on this project, the project is eligible for advanced construction across 2 years, as it is expected to have at least 2 years of required construction. But in order to fund it, staff are requesting consideration for the removal of the $15 million contribution by the MPO to the Boston Bridge Replacement B16365 Storrow Drive over Bowker Ramps project that was brought forward for funding consideration by MassDOT as part of the March 30th meeting. The project is still funded with $116.1 million by MassDOT in its statewide highway program, in federal fiscal years 27 and 26. But the removal of this project would remove the MPO's contribution in federal fiscal year 2027. That said, the removal of this contribution would not only allow for the increase of funding to cover this cost increase on Ipswich's resurfacing project for Central and High Street, but would also increase the amount of total regional target balance available for that project from its current amount of $1.95 million up to a revised funding amount of approximately $2 million in federal fiscal year 2027. With that, for some next steps, staff are happy to clarify any additional information presented today, and of course, discuss the implications that these changes will have for the projected release of the draft tip at next week's April 20th MPO board meeting. Staff are requesting a motion to decide on which of the options for MBTA projects and recommendations for the Ipswich projects should be factored into a new scenario, scenario 6, which would be the last one for programming in the draft tip. If we go on to the next slide and the slide after, we can just show those two adjustments side by side for comparison. I'd be happy to open the floor of discussion there.
Thank you, Ethan. Questions for Ethan? Anybody has any questions? Jillian Linnell.
I just want to clarify regarding the MBTA's projects. These total project costs have not changed from what was presented to the MPO. It was a programming element regarding the tip. So there have been no changes to the scope or the costs associated with these projects from what was presented previously.
Right, so I have a question, Ethan. Are these federal aid numbers I'm looking at or gross numbers?
The new numbers that are being programmed, oh, excuse me, I must have turned off my video. The new numbers that are being programmed are comprehensive and inclusive of both the 80% federal aid and the 20% match, as that 20% match does count against the regional target balance as well. So both.
So I'm confused. So I'm sort of confused. In the current Jackson Square, I'll just let me look at one that's like Columbus Avenue. The current amount is 9.4, and the revised amount is 11.7. But what was the federal aid amount in the current tip, and what's the federal aid amount in the revised tip?
Yes, so the federal aid amount is $9.4 million.
In both.
In both, the match being why there is an addition.
Right, but so all you're doing is adding MBTA money to the tip. I don't know why this affects anything like, I don't know why this affects anything, including the transit modernization. If the MBTA just needs 9.4 in federal aid for Columbus Avenue, and they've got 9.4, and all you're saying is they're going to match it, I don't understand. I'm totally lost about why we need to do this. Because I thought what happened was the T said we need 11.7, and we assumed that included their money, but what they really want is 11.7 of federal aid. But I guess I was confused. But all you're doing is adding the T's match to this money?
That's my understanding. The information request presented at the March 30th meeting showed a federal request for what is currently programmed. So the federal 80% numbers being what's in the current tip scenario, and the match request being what was added in here. Right. And this was done under the assumption that the match would actually count.
Right. So Jillian, you need $9.4 million of federal aid for Columbus Avenue.
Correct. That is the federal share that was presented out of a total project cost of 11.7.
Right.
Sorry, an additional amount.
But you're providing the match.
Correct.
Right. So this is just reflecting now MBTA match money on top of the federal aid.
And I should be clear, with the Columbus Ave project, the city of Boston and the MBTA are responsible for the match.
Somebody who's not mascot, I should have said. This is providing the match. Okay. All right. Eric?
So David, that was kind of my question. The point here, though, is that the revised number shouldn't be counting against the regional target, correct?
Right. I'm confused because I think, yes, the T's just saying, don't forget to add our match in. And we're not reducing anything in the regional target to account for their match. Their match is their money, not ours. It's additive to the tip, I think.
Right, it's additive. It's not. So for example, in option 1 on the screen where it says, fiscal year 24 current, at the bottom, regional target balance 7.9, it shouldn't be reducing. It should just be the same.
I think so. Well, so I mean, so here's what it's not like Mass.match is available because we flex the money to the T. So Mass took its money out, the T put its money in. I think it's a wash, right? I think, but I'm confused.
My understanding on these projects is that the amounts that are shown are inclusive of that match plus the federal aid. So you have the federal amount of 80% plus 20%, whereas before all that was programmed was just the 80% with no additional funding. That was at least something that I had programmed or adjusted a programming error on last week to reflect that amount.
Right.
Which was the end of this year.
But I think we all agree with that. Yes, there has to be a 80% plus the match reflected in the tip. What Eric and I are struggling with is that match is being provided by the MBTA, or in certain instances, the MBTA in the city of Boston. And so that match is additive to the tip. It's not reducing any tip money. It's additional money coming into the tip because now the MBTA is matching these federal highway dollars, not MassDOT. It's just a swap out of money, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. So it shouldn't be reducing the regional target amount at balance at the bottom.
Megan?
I think I'm trying to repeat but rephrase slightly what Ethan was saying, which is that what we understand to be the case is that total amount that is called regional target balance includes both the assumption of the available federal dollars plus an added match to that. So our total amounts is not just what's available through the federal dollars. It's always included the assumption of the 20% match. So what we were doing before is instead of including the federal amount plus the match in our assumptions, we were only including the federal amount. So that's why it's just the way that we show these numbers, and we don't show them without the match included. And so when we program the amounts in these tables, we have to have both the federal amount plus the matched amount. That's the understanding that we came out of the conversations last week and why we needed to add in the MBTA match into this table. So it's just sort of an accounting, a number summing, like the way that the table's being represented. And I'm not sure if that makes more sense or not.
Right, I guess where I'm struggling is why we have to reduce the line item for rail modern, assuming that was the option we wanted to go with, the one that would reduce transit modernization. I'm struggling to understand that, right? Because we're not reducing federal aid, right? There's no need for federal aid for transit modernization to be reduced. We're just, right? I mean, all we're talking about is somebody's contribution to the T projects needs to show up in the match. But it appears like you're reducing federal aid in the transit modernization program. And I don't, maybe you're not, maybe you're just reducing, you can't reduce match without reducing federal aid because then you're not having an 80-20 program. So I'm just, again, just confused.
I'm going to throw this out there, and I'm not sure if this is correct, but is it that because before we were only showing the federal amount, the amount the MBTA would actually receive or that is available in federal funds is 80% of the 80%. So it is that gap that is why there is now a gap and why we are having to shift things around.
Right.
Because by only, yeah.
Right, but that was the question I asked originally, and that's not the answer I got, right? I asked, is the federal aid amount for Columbus Avenue the same in the current and in the revised? And the answer was yes. I think in the current tip, there's 9.4 million for federal aid, but maybe not. Maybe that's the issue. And if that's the case, then that's fine. Yes. What happened was we needed to take more money, flex more federal aid because we under-programmed federal aid in the draft. And if that's what happened, then I understand perfectly. But that's not the answer I was given when I asked.
Yes, I think that may have been a misunderstanding on my part as to what the definition of federal aid was, so I apologize for the confusion there. With regard to the second question as to the reduction on the transit modernization program, due to insufficient balance to cover all cost increases in federal fiscal year 2024 and retain any contingency for that year, some of the increases, namely for Jackson Square, had to be reflected in federal fiscal year 2025, where there was also a lack of contingency there. Therefore, transit modernization was reduced because both projects would be using CMAQ funding, so the same funding source, in order to accommodate the increase. The logic also being that by investing in Jackson Square, which is a transit investment, the reduction from the transit modernization program would be effectively like to like in turn there.
Right, so now I understand perfectly, right? The current tip, these are gross numbers. The current tip has 9.4 million gross, when it really was supposed to have 9.4 million of federal aid, which would be, when you add the T's money and the city's money, would be a gross of 11.75. We underprogrammed the flex amount because we made an assumption that Jillian's numbers were gross numbers and Jillian's numbers were, no, I need 9.4 million of federal aid. I'll bring my own match to the table. Right? Okay, so now the MPO needs to decide which of these two things they want to do, right? And so the only difference between these two is the rail transformation early action. If we reduced it, we would leave ourselves more regional target balance. And if we don't reduce it, you know, we won't, but we can still meet the T's. I mean, I guess we will reduce the regional target balance by $7 million. Gross numbers. Eric?
Thank you. Just to further clarify, what is very confusing. So the regional target number that we have, it includes the federal dollars and the 20% state match, which comes from MassDOT. If we're then using the federal dollars to fund a transit project, MassDOT is no longer saying we're providing that match. So it's like that 20% went away.
Yes.
It's not like that 20% is still in our budget.
Yes.
It's like that 20% went away, and now the MBTA is replacing that 20%.
Yes.
And so that's why the total project for, again, this Columbus Ave one is 11.75, but we only programmed 9.4. And so we now have to show the total cost of it. Okay, I understand that now.
Yes, and to Jillian's first point, the T always had requested 11.75. We just got our wires crossed and underfunded their request.
Okay, and so, and then what Ethan has presented here is basically to say, why don't we reduce the rail transformation program, because that we're funding rail transformation with these other projects, and that way we'll have more cushion. Is that right?
I don't think it's because we're funding rail transformation with other projects. The rail transformation is not a single project, so it is a budget and you can reduce it, but there will be less rail transformation work done if we flex this money to the T, right?
And the justification is because we're funding a lot more other T things.
I guess I think the justification is we didn't want to take this, or we didn't necessarily want to take the $7.9 million regional target balance in 24, because we all talked about how important target balance in the early years is, down to 2.7. I think it's, I think it was we would like to try to keep this number somewhere near the $7.9 million amount. And then a discussion was had between staff and the MBTA, and the MBTA said, well, don't cut one of our projects. You can reduce what you're giving us in rail transformation if you absolutely have to. Is what I think happened. I wasn't there, but that's what I think happened.
So I guess I would just say, I feel like those turn, track improvements are, I feel like we've heard a lot of support for those. And so I guess if we if we stick with option one, we keep we keep that in, but we have less cushion in the years. Is that's the trade-off, right?
I believe so. Ethan, correct me if I say anything wrong.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Right. Melissa?
Yes, so between David and Eric, could you guys summarize what you just said? Because I was following it and it is a little confusing and I need to better understand in a concise way what the MPO is like, what the trade-offs were with these options, and I'm not clear.
Yeah, so I will try, and both Ethan and Jillian should correct me. So I believe, so if you look at option one, if we kept the T's requests as funded as requested and accounted for the fact that it should be gross, not federal aid only, our regional target balance for 24 would go down from 7.93 million to 2.78. If we wanted to keep that regional balance at that level or even higher, the only project that we could do that would not eliminate a project would be to reduce our contribution to rail transformation. That will, however, reduce funding for rail transformation and may have impacts on things like the turn track that Eric was talking about. I don't know what part of rail transformation wouldn't get done if we underfund it by whatever this would be, 14 million minus 6 by $8 million. I'm not sure, but it could be the turn track in, I think it was Haverhill or on one of those lines might be what gets sacrificed, but I don't know the answer to that. Ethan?
Yeah, thank you.
So thanks, David. Wait, just on that. So thanks, Dave, that helps. Ethan, and then if you could, as you explain, try to explain what those trade-offs were with the defunding of the rail transformation. I don't know what that means. Is that rail to trails? Is that actual rail?
Yeah, so the rail transformation I will let Ethan talk in a second. The rail transformation program is about making improvements to commuter rail to be able to increase headways and schedules and frequencies. So it is, and I believe this part of rail transformation is no regrets improvements, so that it would not be sufficient necessarily to go to 15-minute headways, but it would help you get towards 15-minute headways, and it would still make operational improvements even if you don't get to 15-minute headways, I think.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Yep, Ethan?
Yeah, thank you. To clarify on the rail transformation project, this funding is additive to investments that the MBTA is already making within the CIP for rail transformation. There were 2 work zones that were requested under the initial fully funded line. $14 million, about 11 million of that would have gone towards the Reading Station project, which would have added a turn track to Reading Station. The reduction of funding from this line item reduces and eliminates that improvement from the project, leaving the second project, which would be signals and additional track improvements at the Wilbur interlocking, which is near Anderson Woburn Station, to be included. Those signals would be what would enable improved headways on the Lowell line by making those improvements there, which are currently at about 40-minute headways peak time down to 30. That improvement would still be retained. It would be the loss of the Reading improvement that would be impacted by option 2. With regard to the transit modernization program, to clarify there, that program is an investment program that will be managed similarly to the Community Connections program, where applicants for funding, which can include municipalities or RTAs or the MBTA, can seek investment from the MPO, just as they may for Community Connections already, to fund transit initiatives like transit signal priority, station repairs, etc.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. And if we reduce it by $8 million, what percentage of the total is that?
So right now, the project, the rail transformation project is being reduced by about half, down to 6.05, and transit modernization is currently funded at each year of the TIP at $6.5 million. This reduction will only impact federal fiscal year 25. It would be reduced from 6.5 million to $2 million I believe the total amount of transit modernization funding in the scenario would be about 21.5 million across all 5 years of the TIP. So only a decrease of about $4.5 million against what is currently around $26 million.
Okay, thank you.
Darlene?
Yeah, thank you. I think that was the gist of my question. I was trying to understand what the impacts to the rail transformation early action items were. And so just to confirm, I guess, Ethan, and if you're saying the impact is to the Reading Station, is that really just an impact from MPO funding perspective? Like it'll be funded elsewhere by the MBTA or kind of kicking the can down the line for future funding?
It would be the latter, where it would have to seek future funding from either additional investment through the CIP or potentially in a future TIP.
Okay.
It would not be funded this time.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions on this issue? Seeing none, Ethan needs us to come to a conclusion about which of these two options we prefer. So, Eric Barassa.
I'll make a motion to support option 1.
Is there a second? Matt Moran.
I'd like to second that motion, please.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
David Muller,
Yes.
Marie Rose,
Yes.
John Romano,
Oh, I'm sorry. John had to step out.
okay, thank you. Ally Clayman,
Ally Clayman, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
thank you. Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Amira Patterson,
Amira Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Matt Moran,
Matt Moran, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Rob King,
Rob King, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tintakis,
Melissa Tintopoulos, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Great. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ethan, I think you need other answers from us, maybe?
Yes, I do need one more answer. If we can back up about 1 or 2 slides. Back. Forward, or maybe back 1, back towards the Ipswich project for that recommendation. There we go. And then up 1, sorry. This, yes, thank you. Just looking for confirmation and endorsement on this recommended change for the Ipswich project, removing the funding from the Bowker Overpass project and increasing funding in federal fiscal year 27 to cover the cost increase.
Okay. Eric Barassa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question here is, Ethan, what I didn't understand from your presentation is the full amount that's requested, will that continue with this project, or will this increase not be included now?
This recommendation would fund that increase for Ipswich, but it would not fund Bowker. So effectively that contribution would be removed. So Ipswich is made whole.
Ipswich is made whole, and the 15 additional for Bowker goes away, and the Bowker project does not get that funds, and presumably that has to be figured out somewhere else.
Yes.
And I guess I'd be interested, to hear from maybe Marie Rose or MassDOT just about sort of the implications of that, and kind of maybe even better understanding kind of what that 15 million was. I know it's hard to say, oh, it's just part of the whole project, but it'd be interesting if someone could speak to that.
Right, well, we certainly can't speak to what that $15 million covers. It is a project, right?
Right.
But what will happen is MassDOT will backfill that and kick other projects out of our part of the TIP. Right? We will have to go in and find $15 million of other stuff that we were going to do that we won't do. And we will try to concentrate it in this region, right? We will try to take that $15 million out of other statewide items in the Boston region if we can. So that, you know, we don't have to go back to other MPOs and change our commitment because Boston made a decision that they didn't want to fund their stuff anymore. Which is okay. I mean, you know, we thank you for saying yes. If you say no, we'll go figure it out.
And again, the trade-off here is that if we keep, well, yeah, I better explain the trade-off here. If we are we in this proposal here, we're if we say keep the funding for Bowker, then what happens to Ipswich?
I don't know, because to reverse that, what we're also saying here is a project that doubled in cost is worth the money. Without having any presentation on why it doubled in cost and how good it is or how bad it is. That's fine, you know, for my purposes, I wish we hadn't updated the 25% funding yet, because this is a 26 project, right? We're gonna, all these funding cost increases will be updated in when we do the 25 tip, and then they'll be updated when we do the 26 tip. This is sort of a, we should have just, MassDOT should have not actually updated our project cost yet, because we could have released the tip, got the tip voted, then come back next year and say, hey, by the way, as all our costs have gone up or down, this one's now $11 million. What do you think? That didn't happen. So we either have to put it in for 11 or, you know, I guess, I don't know what we would do if we don't do this, right? But I would not in the future try to amend future year projects for cost increases as we're trying to develop a tip. Ethan?
Yes, thank you. With regard to other projects in federal fiscal year 2027, as part of this recommendation, there were other new projects added to federal fiscal year 2027 that may have been potential candidates for removal. The amount of funding that they had in them was insufficient to cover the increase. For example, Malden's project, which was the Spot Pond Brook Greenway project, was a $4.4 million project and therefore insufficient to cover the $6 million request in 27. Similarly, Everett's multimodal project on Route 16, which would not have been funded otherwise if the MPO did not fund it, was about $5 million. So none of the other new project options in 27 could be selected. Bowker, being the largest, was the one that could have accommodated this shift, which is also why the project was recommended for funding across 2 years, because only one project was new to funding in federal fiscal year 2026, being Boston's Cambridge Street project.
Yeah, and then, you know, the Ipswich project is a regional project, a local, quote unquote, a local project. Bowker isn't. I totally understand why this is where you would go. It's just, it does have a ripple effect that you can't see because we don't know what we'll do. But at some point you are kicking other projects off the tip, and they are probably Boston area projects. That's all. So if we don't do this, Ethan needs to know what else we would do in its place, because having you know, there's an $11.7 million project that is currently funded in the tip for 5.7. Jim Fitzgerald.
So, I mean, I think the city supports the Bowker project for sure. And, you know, I guess I should ask this at the last meeting, but, you know, obviously shifting the 15 to the tip, I think we support it because we support the project, but where does it get us? I mean, does it mean it's going to start quicker? It doesn't look like it. So, and if we're not seeing the benefit to the Boston region of pulling it from the state to here, I guess that's probably what Eric was getting at, right?
Right. Yeah, so again, we're committed to Bowker. Bowker will get funded. We will backfill this gap. But if you look at our regional, our tip and look at the statewide items, we will likely take statewide items out of other communities in order to backfill Bowker back into our side of the tip. And those communities will likely be in the Boston region if we can make that work. So you're basically trading Ipswich cost increase for deletion of other projects out of the tip that you don't know yet because we don't know if we're actually going to have to do that. David Kozis.
I mean, is it possible to hear a little bit more about the Ipswich project again? Maybe just why is it a regional project? It seems like it's a lot of it is resurfacing, but it does say that there's also work that's not really resurfacing. Maybe this could just be summarized again, what this project is all about.
Ethan, can you give us a summary?
Yes, I can provide a brief summary here. Unfortunately, I had spoken with the municipality of Ipswich and staff over the DPW, but unfortunately they could not attend this meeting today. They had spoken with their consultant, TEC, to speak further about the project. That said, my understanding of the project scope as it is while it is a resurfacing project, elements of the project, which go through Ipswich's downtown, roughly where the river bends, about kind of an S shape up to Lord Square, down to Miller Street, would include multimodal accommodations as well, including new sidewalks, traffic safety enhancements throughout their kind of downtown area, which may have been a key driver. As stated, the 25% design is what the key consideration was for this project. Excuse me. With regard to where it is, it's currently at an estimated cost for execution in roughly summer 2026. It's about 3,200 feet of roadway reconstruction and service with some geometry improvements also included to improve intersection safety and also ADA accessibility improvements at the ramps. One of the main drivers, which may have been a consideration, is, as I recall, there is a culvert in the project area, which is currently undersized and would need to be widened, in addition to other drainage in the area, Ipswich being a coastal town, also having wetlands involved as well.
Thank you, Ethan. Jay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think the question is, was there a scope change here? I mean, all that description sounds great, but we don't really know, like, did that change? Was this a different project where was the culvert added, where sidewalks added? I guess that's kind of trying to make a decision here without really knowing, without really having much information, either on the Bowker side or the Ipswich side.
Ethan, Rick Clark is here. Why don't we let him answer first, and then if there are other questions you can take on. Rick?
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so the project, I mean, it's been on for the last 10 years. We hired TEC just within the last 2 years to move it forward. We had to get rid of our old consultant. It just wasn't moving forward. So from the start of the cost till now, with the last 10 years of prices, they're also looking to relocate some telephone poles, and also looking to do either a rotary or light at the 5 corner intersection. So, and with the drainage issue that we have, the culvert, that was the majority of the increase of the cost.
Thank you. So, Eric?
I mean, obviously we have to make a decision, and it just is what it is. This is sort of the information before us. I would say, I guess I would make a motion to keep the Ipswich project. I feel like we've heard about it for a long time, even though this cost increase is, has doubled it. And David, I hear what you're saying about, potentially, taking off other projects in the Boston region that are funded with the MassDOT side of the funds, and I think we just have to, take that risk. So I would make a motion to remove the 15 million for Bowker and fund the Ipswich project.
Is there a second?
I second the motion.
Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. Marie Rose seconded the motion.
Yes, Marie Rose, thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Please call the roll.
David Muller,
Yes.
Marie Rose.
Yes.
I believe John Romano is still out of the meeting, so I'll go to Ally Clayman,
Ally Clayman, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes.
Amira Patterson,
Mayor Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Dickens, yes.
Matt Moran,
Matt Moran, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Rob King,
Rob King, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Melissa Tantakis,
Melissa Tantakis, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
All right, motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And with everybody's indulgence, I'd like to flip the last two items on the agenda and take up the LRTP next. I think there's a lot of people who've been waiting for that one, and we were, I don't want to say that the other isn't important, of course it is, but we'll take up the LRTP next. And I believe Representative Michelle Shikola would like to comment at this time. Whenever you're ready, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be back in front of the Boston MPO. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. I just wanted to be very brief. I think you heard earlier during the public comment period some comments about the Bedford Street, Hartwell Ave, 4225 intersection in Lexington, asking that it be retained on the long-range transportation plan, Destination 2050, specifically for the FY 2029 to 2033 time band. This is an incredibly important project of regional significance. It's not just the town of Lexington that accesses this intersection. The interchange services Bedford, Carlisle, Westford, Billerica, and the area has more than 30,000 average daily traffic through the corridor. You, I'm sure, are all familiar that the Minuteman Trail is one of the most heavily traveled trails in the country, and this project also interfaces with that trail connection. Hanscom Air Force Base itself has more than 10,000 employees, is one of the most important regional employers. Lincoln Labs and the surrounding biotech firms up and down the Hartwell Ave corridor, we're probably closer to 15,000 employees. It's incredibly important regional project. We are very proud to say as well that last night Lexington Town Meeting passed its version of the MBTA zoning. And not only did we pass a robust plan, we had 12 distinct districts across the entire town of Lexington for 227 acres, which is about 4.5 times the minimum 50-acre requirement, even higher when you consider that the acres that we passed last night for by right multifamily housing did not include roads. So this is actual real buildable spots, and a lot of that area is along the Hartwell Ave corridor. So this upgrade is going to be essential to allowing us to have better transit, to move more people through that corridor, and to be a real successful and important part of the regional economy. So I thank you for taking me out of order and appreciate the opportunity to make some brief remarks.
Thank you, Representative. Bradley Putnam, you want to give your presentation now, Bradley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Still morning. I'd like to speak today about investment programs and projects in Destination 2050, the long-range transportation plan that's under development now. First, I'd like to tell the board about 3 comment letters that staff have received in the last couple of days. The first came from the Lexington Chamber of Commerce Executive Director Heather Hartstrom. The letter expressed support for the project that was just mentioned, routes 4 and 225, Bedford Street and Hartwell Avenue at I-95. The letter said that it was the area is a key commuter route with access points to Interstate 95 improvements, and it would improve the corridor beyond the town of Lexington to adjoining towns. And the letter advocated for including the project in the long-range transportation plan and in a future TIP. Second piece of correspondence that staff received also related to this project in Lexington from the town of Lexington. The correspondence talked about the improvements to safety and capacity management that the project would provide. It said that the town's consultant is developing a design for the project. And it said also, as previously mentioned, that Lexington Town Meeting recently voted to add multifamily residential zoning. And then the third letter that staff have received related to the long-range plan was from the city of Boston regarding bike share. This letter was also previously mentioned in the meeting. The letter was from Jessica Franklin Hodge, Chief of Streets for the city of Boston. The letter supports the proposed bike share support investment program in the long-range plan beginning in federal fiscal year 2029. The letter said that the new investment program will enable Boston and partner municipalities who make up the Blue Bike system to continue to strengthen and grow bike share in the region. So those are public comment letters that were received recently. If you could go back one slide, please. No, okay, no, go to the next one. All right, so there are two topics I'd like to talk about today. Back one slide, please. Two topics I'd like to talk about today that are interrelated. One is funding allocations to investment programs in the long-range transportation plan, and the other is projects that would be included in the long-range plan. Next slide, please. So my goal for today, which I'll come back to at the end of the presentation, I'd like to know what questions members have about this material. I'd like to know if there are other projects that members believe are required to be included in the long-range transportation plan. And I would like to know what additional information members need in order to vote on these topics, funding allocations and project selection for the long-range plan at your next meeting, April 20th, next week. Next slide, please. So some supporting materials have been posted to the MPO website on these topics. The first is a memo with the MPO's adopted policies for its major infrastructure program and for project selection for the long-range transportation plan. That memo has been posted to today's meeting materials, as well as a recording of a portion of the meeting on January 26th, in which this topic was discussed. Another item that's been posted is the universe of projects for the long-range transportation plan that were presented to this board on March 2nd. And then the third item another item that's been posted to today's meeting webpage is the memo for staff proposals for changes to investment programs in the long-range plan, which was presented to this board on March 16th. Next slide, please. So as a reminder of Destination 2050 development activities, today's discussion relates to allocating funds to projects and programs, and the decisions that this board will be asked to make next week would help to inform the next phase of the Destination 2050 development, which would be documentation, documenting the MPO's decisions and related information. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, the long-range transportation plan, Destination 2050, covers a time span from 2024 to 2050 over a 20-year span. The allocation of funding to investment programs would cover the entire span of the time horizon of this document, as shown by the yellow box on this slide. And then project selection would relate to only the first 10 years of the plan, as shown by the green boxes in this slide, 2024 through 2033. And there'd be no projects programmed after 2033, as shown by the gray box on this slide. Next slide, please. So to talk about investment programs, as a reminder, in the Destination 2040, the MPO's most recent long-range transportation plan, which was passed in 2019. These were the investment programs in that, the funding goals laid out for investment programs in that plan. The largest investment program was the Complete Streets program, in which the MPO set a goal of funding allocating 45% of available funding to complete streets projects. The next largest program was the Major Infrastructure Program with 30%, followed by the Intersection Improvements Program at 13%, the Bicycle Network and Pedestrians Program at 5%, the Transit Modernization Program at 5%, and the Community Connections Program at 2%. Next slide, please. So just to assign some theoretical dollar values to these percentages, the total, according to the Massachusetts Association of Regional Planning Agencies, the total amount of projected regional target highway funds available to the MPO in the 2029 through 2033 time band would be 833 million. If the MPO were to apply its previous funding percentages from the 2019 Destination 2040 long range plan to that anticipated funding in the 29 to 33 time band, this table would give you a sense of how much that would translate into in dollar terms. So 45% of that 833 million, if that went to complete streets, that would be about $375 million over the span of that 5-year time period. And similarly, the major infrastructure, if 30% of that 833 million was spent on major infrastructure, that would be about 250 million over that period of time, and so on down the table with smaller percentage amounts and corresponding smaller dollar amounts. Next slide, please. And so just to remind the board of some projects, of what types of projects have been included up to this point under these investment programs. The Weston Reconstruction of Route 30 project is an example of the Complete Streets program. The McGrath Boulevard project in Somerville is part of the major infrastructure program. The Norwood Route 1 University Avenue project is part of the intersection improvements program. The multi-use path in Peabody is part of the bicycle network and the pedestrian connections program. Lynn's station improvements are part of the transit modernization program, and the Newton microtransit service is part of the community connections program. Next slide, please. So as a reminder of the recommendations that staff made to this board on March 16th regarding Destination 2050 investment programs, staff had proposed that the board could maintain 5 existing investment programs: a complete streets program, major infrastructure, intersection improvements, bicycle network and pedestrian connections, and community connections. Staff had proposed adding a bike share support program at the suggestion of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is the regional administrator for the bike share program. Staff had also proposed that the MPO could broaden the existing transit modernization program into a transit transformation program that could begin in federal fiscal year 2029. Next slide, please. So with regards to the proposal of a bike share support program, staff wanted to point out that in the TIP scenario for 2024-28 that this board voted on March 30th, that scenario includes some investments in bike share that are outside of the current Community Connections program. It would include $6 million for bike share state of good repair set aside, $1 million for electric blue bikes in Boston, and $0.4 million for electric blue bikes in Cambridge. So in total, that's about $7.4 million in bike share investments. And that amount is roughly 1% of the approximately $700 million available in the 24-28 TIP. So if the MPO were to choose to fund a bike share support program, 1% could be one amount to consider based on the amount that's been programmed in the 24-28 TIP scenario. Next slide, please. So some more information for this board to consider. MPO staff conducted a survey of the public, asking the public about investments in transportation in a broad sense. The public survey opened on March 28th. Staff have received about 250 responses from members of the public. And the survey contained one question. The question was, if you had 100 tokens to allocate to transportation improvements in the Boston region, how would you spend them? So respondents were given 6 options to which they could allocate their tokens. The options were not the same as the MPO investment programs. The reason for that was that staff wanted to give the public an opportunity to engage more directly in particular modes of transportation, rather than trying to finesse the potential overlap between the MPO's investment programs. Next slide, please. So the 6 options that the public were given as ways to allocate their tokens. One would be the major transit infrastructure, such as extending subway or commuter rail lines. Another would be the major road infrastructure, such as repairing or replacing bridges and highways. Another would be the bus improvements, such as dedicated bus lanes and upgrading and electrifying bus fleets. Next slide, please. A fourth would be the pedestrian and bicycle improvements, such as bike lanes, shared paths, rail trails, and blue bike stations. A fifth would be transit improvements to existing transit infrastructure, such as upgrading, modernizing subway, commuter rail stations, and fleets. And the 6th option would be community shuttles, which would connect people to businesses, shopping centers, and hospitals. Next slide, please. So of these 250 responses from people who chose to respond to this survey, you can see in the bold column in the middle, the average number of tokens that respondents allocated to these areas. The most popular responses were major transit infrastructure and transit improvements, which on average respondents allocated 25 tokens apiece to those areas. And on the right, the two columns to the right, you can just see the first and third quartile of responses, just to give a sense of the distribution of responses. The third most popular area that respondents indicated was bicycle and pedestrian improvements, to which they allocated an average of 18 tokens, followed by bus improvements with 14 tokens, major road infrastructure with 12 tokens, and community shuttles with 6. So again, these areas do not correspond one-to-one to the MPO's investment programs. This is just another piece of information for the board to consider when thinking about funding allocations in the long-range plan. Next slide, please. In addition to that, MPO staff asked members of the board for their individual opinions about how to allocate funding to long-range plan investment programs. Members were asked to respond to the poll between April 3rd and 10th. There were 8 members of the board who responded, and the poll asked one question, which was, what percentage of funding would you allocate to each long-range plan investment program? Next slide, please. And so averaging these 8 responses together, the program to which members assigned the highest percentage on average was complete streets at 38%. You can see the minimum and maximum responses among the 8 and the next 2 columns. But in the bold column in the middle, major infrastructure members assigned on average 35% of funding, intersection improvements on average 9%, bicycle network pedestrian 5%, transit transformation on average members would have assigned 8%, community connections 2%, and bike share support 3%. Next slide, please. So this just shows you a few different possible ways to allocate funding among investment programs. You see the column for 2019, those were the funding levels. This is just summarizing what's already been said. Those were the funding levels in 2019, 45% to complete streets, 30% to major infrastructure, and so on down. The bike share support program did not exist in 2019, so it had no funding. In the next column, it says add bike share. That's the same as the column you see in 2019, with the exception of if bike share support were funded at 1%, 1% would have to be taken away from something else. One possibility for this board to consider might be to reduce the intersection improvements program by 1%. Reason being that there's a fair amount of overlap between the complete streets program and an intersection improvements program. Depending on the nature of a project, it might qualify for one or the other, so there could be some flexibility there. And then the rightmost column on this table is just restating the average of responses from the 8 members who responded to the poll. And you can see that on average, members suggested funding complete streets at 38%, slightly lower than it was in 2019. Major infrastructure at 35%, somewhat higher than it was in 2019. And the other program areas you can see are somewhat similar to the 2019 funding levels. 9% for intersection improvements, 5% for bicycle network pedestrian connections, 8% for transit transformation, 2% for community connections, and 3% for bike share. Next slide, please. So now about projects. Next slide, please. So I'd like to remind the board that on October 1st, 2020, this board adopted a new policy for listing projects in the long-range transportation plan. And the policy this board adopted was that the long-range transportation plan would only list projects that are federally required to be in the long-range transportation plan. And the projects that are required to be in the plan are those that are regionally significant according to Federal Highway Administration guidance, as well as those that are under heightened review under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, that use federal funds. This board also voted in adopting that policy in 2020, the projects would only be programmed in the first 2 5-year time bands of the long-range plan, which for this plan would be 2024 through 2033, leaving later bands to be programmed to future long-range plans. Next slide, please. So according to federal highway definitions, a regionally significant project could be one that is a major infrastructure project as funded under the MPO's Major Infrastructure Investment Program. A regionally significant project per federal highway would also need to change the capacity of the transportation system by adding lanes to a roadway or potentially by extending a passenger rail line. And as said before, for a project to be listed in the long-range plan, it would need to be ready to be advertised for construction by 2033. And so members had a chance to see the universe of projects that was attached to the information for this meeting. MPO staff gathered information about the projects in that universe in order to try and make a determination about which projects meet any of those criteria above. And so for one or more of those reasons might be required to be listed in the long range plan. And these projects could be funded by the MPO in their 24-28 TIP, or they could be MassDOT projects. So I'd like to talk about those projects now. Next slide, please. So there are two projects in the 24-28 TIP that, based on the information that staff gathered, would be required to be listed in the long range plan. The first is the Interstate 495 and Route 1A ramps project in Rentham, which is funded in the current scenario in federal fiscal year 2024. The next would be the Route 1 at University Avenue and Everett Street project in Norwood, which under the current TIP would be funded in federal fiscal years 26 through 27. Next slide, please. And then two other MPO funded projects in the 24-28 TIP. The McGrath Boulevard project would be programmed in federal fiscal years 27 and 28. The Rutherford Avenue project in Boston would be programmed in the same years, 27 through 28. Next slide, please. And then MassDOT projects, based on the information that staff gathered, these MassDOT projects would appear to be required to be listed in the long range plan based on their regional characteristics. The intersection of routes 9 and 27 in Natick, the interchange of Interstate 495 and Interstate 90 in Hopkinton, which is a project that's already been advertised, and the Alston multimodal project in Boston. Next slide, please. This is just a summary of those 7 projects. Based on the information staff gathered, these projects would be required to be listed in the long range plan. 4 MPO projects that are in the current TIP: Rentham, Norwood, Somerville, and Boston, and 3 MassDOT projects: Natick, Hopkinton, and Boston. Next slide, please. So I'd like to say a little bit more about these 4 MPO projects that would need to be listed in the long range plan. All 4 of these projects are programmed for 1 or more years of funding in the 2024-28 TIP scenario that this board voted to adopt on March 30th. 2 of these projects, Somerville McGrath Boulevard and Boston Rutherford Avenue, there would be the potential for the MPO to continue programming additional funding for these projects beyond 2028 into the second 5-year time band of the long range plan, which is 2029 to 2033. And so this slide here, please go to that slide. Yeah, so this slide here gives a little bit more detail about what some of that funding could potentially be. So the Rutherford Avenue project, the MPO might have the option of contributing another 33 to 44 million per year for 4 years, in 2029 through 2032, for a total of 153 million over that time period. Similarly, there's a possibility that the MPO could contribute additional money to the McGrath Boulevard project in 2029 and 2030, 20 million and 13 or so million, for a total of 33.8 million. And so those 2 projects added together, there's the potential for the MPO to program as much as 187.5 million to those 2 projects in the 29 to 33 time band. Next slide, please. And so to go back to the discussion of the major infrastructure program under which those 2 projects are programmed, again, the total regional highway funds projected to be available to the MPO in the 29 to 33 time band is $833 million. If the MPO were to continue to allocate 30% of their funding to major infrastructure program, as happened in 2019, that would be approximately $250 million that's available over that time band. Next slide, please. And so then putting it all together, those 2 projects, if the MPO were to continue funding them at those levels, that would use 76% of that funding. That there'd be 187 million in spending for those 2 projects put together, which would be 76% of the approximately 250 million that would be available for the major infrastructure program, leaving only 62.4 million, 24% available that's not yet allocated to projects. Next slide, please. So in summary, the table on the left is one possible way of going about funding major infrastructure programs, of funding investment programs. This would be the 2019 plus bike share. This is one way of doing it, where if bike share were funded at 1%, the intersection improvements program could be reduced by 1%. That's just one possible way of doing it. The list of projects you see on the right are the projects that, based on the information that staff gathered, staff believe are required to be listed in the long-range plan. 4 MPO projects in Rentham, Norwood, Somerville, and Boston, and 3 MassDOT projects in Natick, Hopkinton, and Boston. Next slide, please. So back to the beginning. What questions do you have? Are there other projects that members believe do need to be included? They're required to be included in the MPO's long-range plan. What additional information do members need in order to make a vote, in order to vote on funding allocations and project selections at your next meeting on April 20th, 1 week from today? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Bradley. Questions from the members? David Kozis.
Okay. Just a question so I could understand this a little bit better. The transit modernization, right? That, or the transit transformation now, I guess. That would be really huge ticket items, right? Not like our community connections, much smaller. So I think the example in this presentation, Bradley, was extending subway lines, right? Or maybe it's something like the Symphony Station or something like that would be transit modernization. But in the chart, it showed, I think, like 41 or $42 million. So I'm not really understanding, are we talking about transit modernization in terms of just flexing 5% of our funds toward much bigger projects, like a small piece of the funding for huge projects? Or what kind of transit transformation projects would we be looking to fund?
David, thank you for asking about this. So this is another decision for the members to make. So that currently the MPO has a transit modernization program, which funds the sorts of projects you were mentioning, such as the Symphony or LIM. And so when MPO staff were talking with members earlier this year about potential changes to investment programs, one proposal that came up from members was that the current transit modernization program could, if the MPO decides, could be broadened into a more comprehensive program that would have greater capacity to fund more elements of transit. There's a brief discussion of what such a program could look like in the memo from March 16th that is posted to today's meeting materials. But basically, if this board were to decide to broaden its transit program, then I think that would take additional work for staff in the coming months to flesh out more potential elements of that program for the board's consideration. And so I don't think it's a decision. If the board were to decide to modernize that, to expand that program as part of this long range plan, I think that would necessitate further work later to flesh out the details. But the reason to consider it right now is because this is the long range plan that would be in effect for the next 4 years. And it's possible that such a program could take effect before the next long range plan. So I think for the time being, if you were to switch from a transit modernization program to a transit transformation program, I think it'd be something of a placeholder in this long range plan for now.
Okay, so I appreciate that. And it needs to be fleshed out more. It seems like we're talking about like maybe fully funding smaller projects, not really what something like just paying toward a bigger project. But we don't know right now.
Yeah, no, and I think that would be a conversation. I think there could be future conversations about that. But I think the trade-off for this board to consider is if you were to allocate more funding to a transit program, that would involve reducing your funding goal for other programs.
Thank you.
So David Moeller had to step away, so I'm going to chair the meeting until he comes back. So I'll call on Leonard.
Thank you, Eric. And so, can you go to your question slide, please, Bradley?
Yeah, Aaron, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so the other projects, so the projects that you've shown, that you've listed today, are the only ones that are under consideration for the LRTP?
So as far as staff know, those are the projects that are required to be listed in the long range plan. And in previous long range plans, there had been a larger number of projects listed.
Yeah,
and since 2019, when the last long range plan was developed, since then, both Federal Highway Administration and MassDOT issued new guidance to MPOs recommending that MPOs only list in their long range plans projects that are required to be in the long range plan, so as to allow MPOs maximum flexibility going forward in how to allocate their funds beyond the current TIP cycle.
Right.
The MPO would, if you so choose, have the option of listing additional projects in your long range plan. but those would be, if you did, it would be beyond those that would be required to be listed in the plan.
Right. So we don't have to list. So then when would we select the projects being for list? When would we choose these projects if we don't have to list? If we weren't going to choose them by next week, when would we choose them?
So if a project, if members feel that you're able to vote on this next week, then I think what I would ask is what options would you like? Because you could have the option of just voting on the projects that, as far as staff know, are required. But if there are additional projects that you feel should be added or need to be added, then that's another possibility for members to consider.
Right. But I think, Glenn, to answer your what I think is part of the assumed part of your question is the MPO, as projects get ready, the MPO takes annual tip votes, and the MPO could, much like we did with McGrath and Rutherford, start a process at the appropriate time where we say, okay, we're committed to, I'm just going to use the two that people talk about today, Lexington and or Framingham. Let's start putting them in the tip and reserving their money. And if they then triggered the requirement that they be in the plan, we'd also put them in the plan. But you don't have to get in the plan as a listed project to get in the tip, even if you are a big, expensive project.
Okay, I understand that. I was just trying to understand what would be put in the LRTP so that people know that we're at least considering these projects in the RTP. Because if we're not going to tell ourselves and the public what we're considering in the LRTP, then I'm not really clear of the point of the process. I hate to put it that way because it doesn't sound positive, but I'm just trying to understand the rationale. Other than the other aspect that I want to get at is the proportions amongst the various kinds of categories. But I'll come to that later. So you understand my question about what do we say in the LRTP in terms of projects that we're considering when we put it out this year?
Right. So Bradley, you have an answer for that?
Yeah, thank you, Len. So the long range plan is a comprehensive document that covers a lot of topics, and this board will get to hear more about that in a month or two. And so the long range plan lays out the long-term vision for the region that the MPO has for a minimum of 20 years for federal requirements. And so it'll lay out the MPO's mission, vision, and goals, which were discussed earlier this winter. And it would lay out goals for funding allocations to different investment programs, which is part of this presentation. And it would also list some projects, at minimum those that are required to be listed per federal regulations. And so the long-range plan would include all of that at a minimum.
Okay. All right. So I guess, and so I'll ask my other question and then maybe come back to the other one later on. So in terms of allocations, I know the needs assessment isn't ready yet, but do you have a sense, from what you know of the needs assessment, that the allocations that we've used in the last cycle would still be good for this cycle?
Yeah. Thank you, Len. So I think maybe some information that could be useful for this board, and tell me if you feel otherwise. Next week, you could take a look at how much funding has been allocated over the last couple of TIPs by investment program. And you could see how that matches up with the goals that were set in 2019.
Okay, great. Because maybe, am I being unreasonable in saying that I think we need to have a good sense of what the needs are in order to be able to really give input on what the allocations should be?
I don't think that's unreasonable, and I don't know. Okay. I don't know how much need definition we'll have.
Right. Okay. That's right. Where I'm kind of at with the allocation. I just kind of feel that I can't answer that question without knowing more, other than just to assume that it's not going to change much. From year to year, and to say that we should, base our needs assessment on what we've done in the previous TIP. Well, we kind of try to keep that TIP within the framework, of our current allocations. So I can't say that gives us guidance as to what the needs are. It kind of gives us, an impression of how well we've kind of stuck with, the allocations that we, determined for the last cycle. All right, I'm going to stop talking, unless someone else come in, maybe I'll follow up later on. Thank you.
Yep. Eric?
Thank you. So I guess my feeling has always been that definitely the long range plan should not be a 20 or 25-year capital plan, because it's ridiculous to be programming projects 30 years or 25 years from now or something like that. I do think that the first two time bands, or sort of the next 10 years, is a really important time to be identifying some of these major projects, and particularly sending a signal to both MassDOT and the municipalities. I would say for the ones that are beyond the 5 years of the TIP, those are some next ones that are really in the queue, and kind of what is the plan to kind of get those going. And so I guess to sort of respond to what Len is saying, like, I think there does need to be some sense of what are there some regional priorities that we need to be identifying. In the past, we have committed to some projects. So I guess one question I would have, we heard public comment today for two projects that had previously been identified in the plan, the Framingham project, and this Lexington project. And so one question is, like, what happens to those projects? Did they not show up in the plan, and what is it? Does that signal a lack or a loss of commitment from the MPO, and what are the implications of that?
Bradley, I think that's for you. Maybe, I'm not sure.
Eric, I agree with you. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, Eric, I'll take it. I'll take a chance at answering it. So I think I have to go back the other way. Is putting it in the LRTP a sign of commitment that the MPO plans to fund it with regional target, right? I mean, I don't know how to answer that question other than by turning it on its head. I'm not sure what it means to put a project in the out years other than the MPO cares about it. I mean, it's not a commitment of future funding necessarily, except because we have a financially constrained plan. We've always assumed it was, and that if you got in the plan, you should be funded in the TIP, because we said whatever time frame we said it, we cared about your project enough that we thought it should be funded with our revenue, right? This is MPO revenue we're programming. So if putting it in the plan is both a commitment from the MPO that when the project gets ready, we will fund it, and the signal to MassDOT of the MPO's got the money and is committed, let's get it done, I guess. Did that answer your question?
No, I mean, I think, I guess that in terms of this long-range plan development, I think we need some time to talk about if there are projects that were previously listed that we are now planning not to. I think we should discuss what are the implications of that? Because I agree with you. I think my understanding from years past was that when we had projects listed, I'm thinking of the Rutherford project, it was listed in the long range plan. And then when it was that first time band year was sort of eligible, the city of Boston made a convincing argument to say, let's program a little bit of funding for that, with an understanding that it was going to be advanced constructed over many years. Now, obviously that project has been complicated, it's been pushed back, yada, yada. But that was an example of sort of the MPO showing that, commitment, because it had been in the long range plan. And then when the year came, due, we then did program it on the TIP. So I think it's worth having that conversation to understand what are the implications then if we're not, if we're not programming these, or we're not identifying, I guess programming is the wrong word. If we're not identifying them in the long range plan, is there a change in something there? Because, we had, numerous people come and make public comment about these, these projects. And yeah, I think that's an important, it's important to understand that before we just saying, the feds have said this is what the policy is, and therefore we change the document. Okay, but what does that actually mean then for how that influences, the development of the TIP when we look at the plan?
Right, but part of this isn't the feds, right? We as an MPO made a decision about what our policy would be about the types of projects we would list. We can always change that decision, whatever. We also made a decision that we wouldn't program funding in the out years. And we made a decision that we would commit 30% of the money to major infrastructure. If you want to add additional projects, you're going to either have to bust the 30%, or you're going to have to show projects in time band 3. That's all perfectly okay. I mean, these are all MPO policies, but it's not like, I suppose we could do a thing where I think Bradley's chart said there's $60 million left of major infrastructure in the second time band. I suppose we could do a thing where we decided to find $60 million worth of projects, but most of them would bleed into time band 3. And because it's a financially constrained document and you can't fund half a project, you didn't have to bleed into time band 3. That's all doable. I mean, we did that in years past. Always, we filled out a 25-year list of projects, many of which never got delivered, but we did it. So we can do that again, or we can do some kind of difference. But it's not just the feds changed their rules, because these were always the feds' rules. We just changed our decisions and our policies, but there are policies, we can change them back.
Okay, I hear that, David. I understand this tension. I guess I would say in some ways maybe this conversation just needs to force the group to have a discussion about some of these projects. So that I think at some point we should talk about the Framingham project. We should talk about the Lexington project. I feel like I remember there was a Natick project somewhere too, but whatever ones I think that are, if the idea is that we're not now identifying them, at some point it would be good. I think we would owe that, to those communities to discuss those projects.
Okay, Dennis Giambetti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're one of those communities.
Just like to follow up on the comments about Framingham. I do think that because it is a change in how we're programming projects, especially in the outer years, I think the perception from the communities is going to be that we're decommitting, at least at some level, of the project, because we're not programming them, right? So there'll be some fear of what this actually means. So we need to make sure the communities that what we're clear in what we're the intent of doing it just from a 10-year time horizon. From the Framingham project, I mean, I can talk about a couple different things. One is that it was on the long-range transportation plan, I think in years early 30s, 34 to 39, something of that nature. So coming off it, we'll have that perception of what does that actually mean? Are you decommitting to it? You heard Eric earlier today describing that there is a significant issue at that add grade crossing, and it's a regional significant issue. That there is universal agreement, I believe, of the problem that is experienced at the intersection and impact it has on both the future expansion of more rail, as well as expansion with traffic implications around that. They're in a transit oriented area. There's about 1,000 additional units of housing being proposed, in addition to 1,000 that was already built in the last 3 or 4 years. So there's been significant changes in that area. I would advocate that to demonstrate at least some level of commitment from the MPO to this project, if it's not going to be programmed, is to take a relook at that area. If you recall, the solution that was purported over a decade ago was received with some mixed reviews by various stakeholders. That it may make sense, and it would be, I think, a signal to the community if the state would then do another look at that, a feasibility study of some nature, to look at, what the potential solution would be given the changes, as well as some of the other aspects to that area. So I would advocate that that we give a commitment to the community of doing a feasibility study for that review. I think that would go a long way, I think, to the community to kind of demonstrate to them that they're still committed to the project, and we want to look at that, even though we're taking it off the third time ban, so to speak. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dennis. Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So look, I understand better now that we are only indicating the major infrastructure projects, in the tip, because they are required. And I guess what I was wondering is, should we, then program projects in the second band for the other categories like complete streets? I'm getting the sense that that isn't something that we want to do, or maybe it's something that we feel that we couldn't do in a prudent way, meaning a way that people could honestly feel that we would keep those projects or advance them into the tip. Because as we said, I guess, a couple of years ago, or when we modified our policy, just because it is in an LRTP doesn't mean, that it's going to automatically get advanced forward. We will do our analysis, our criteria analysis. If it doesn't pass muster, then they don't move forward. And so I get that. And if we decide that we don't want to list any complete street projects or projects in other allocations or other categories, I'm fine with that. With respect to the allocations, I have a lot of respect for staff, and I know that they do all they can. So if we can't get the needs assessment in time for now, then I would say stick with the current allocations, and then when we get the needs assessment, if we see that there's a mismatch, we can then use that for the next LRTP cycle. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Other comments, questions, concerns on this issue? Or any of the issues Bradley has raised? Bradley, do you have what you need from us to proceed for next week or 2 weeks from now, whatever that is, on the 20th?
I think I would just ask somewhat more specifically, all the information that's been posted today and everything you see in these slides, I could just bring these very same things back to you next week for you to then take a vote on this issue. I was just wondering if there's anything beyond what you've seen today that would be additionally helpful to you all in making a decision.
Right. So I think I don't want to give short shrift to what Eric said about we should have an actual discussion about any projects that were in an LRTP. I guess the last LRTP that would not be in this one. Like, is it just those two projects? And were those two projects in the last LRTP, and were they the only ones that would not be funded in the new LRTP?
There was a part of the materials posted today was the universe of projects for this long range plan. The first table in that universe is projects that were listed in the 2019 long range plan. And if it'd be useful at the next meeting, we could talk in more detail about whichever projects members might be interested in. But each project's in a slightly different situation. Some have been constructed, some have been folded into other projects, and some have been funded in a TIP in the intervening years. And the two projects previously mentioned, Lexington and Framingham, have not been programmed in a TIP since 2019.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody? Thank you, Bradley. We are going to skip agenda item number 11 and do it next week. So we will go directly, which is the CIP update from the MBTA and MassDOT. And we will go directly to item 13, final socioeconomic projections for the LRTP. Tim Reardon, whenever you're ready, Tim.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tim Reardon, the Director of Data Services of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. I'm glad to be with you here this afternoon to share with you the current status of our demographic and economic projections for the long-range transportation plan and a variety of other purposes. So let me just share my screen here. You folks all should be able to see my my slides now. This advance. Yep. So as I've talked about before, this is a project that has been underway for a couple of years. A collaboration between MassDOT, the UMass Donahue Institute, MAPC, and in prior years, Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. So what I'll show you today, the way the process was, and we talked about this back in October, UMass Donahue Institute prepares population projections for all of 13 MPO regions in the Commonwealth. MAPC is responsible for developing household and labor force projections. UMass Donahue produces employment projections by industry for those regions. And then MAPC is responsible for allocation down to municipalities, traffic analysis zone or transportation analysis zones, and census blocks. So a couple of important things to remember about these numbers. The demographic projections are based on the patterns of the last 10 years or so. They, you know, it is sort of continuation of current patterns, not an exploratory scenario for what happens if those patterns change a lot. So it's important to remember that. So we're not really assuming any big changes in headship rates or household formation or other things like that. And it's also important to remember that it doesn't account for the interaction of housing supply, housing cost, migration, household formation rates, or the influence of things like national immigration policy, which, as we know, is a big factor in the number of people who are moving to Massachusetts. So the product of this is going to be a sort of business as usual scenario. That's what we'll use for the LRTP and hopefully develop some additional scenarios, both regarding allocation and total growth moving forward after that. And then on employment, the employment growth is limited by the available labor force. So we can't, you know, grow our jobs faster than our labor force. And it's allocated into these 10 super sectors, which I'll describe later. So again, we start with the population growth. It's produced by the UMass Donahue Institute. On the left, there is a chart of total population growth for the 97 communities in the Boston MPO region. And on the right, we break it down by age. The first three columns of each chart or each series are 2000, 2010, and 2020. So those are based on decennial census data and interpretations of that from the Donahue Institute. And then 20, 30, 40, and 50 are the Donahue Institute's projections of population by age for the MPO region. A few things that I note here when I look at this. Number one, the Boston MPO region grew pretty robustly over the 10-year period, and we added 9% to our population over that 10-year period. So faster growth than the prior decade, driven in part by a lot of migration, international immigration in the early part of the decade, and greater retention of residents who would otherwise have moved to other states. However, in the latter part of the decade, a lot of those currents kind of started heading the other way. We saw big decreases in international immigration and more loss of residents to other states. And those factors are included in the forecast that Donahue presented. As a result, the next decade is likely to bring slower growth, only about 10% over the 3 decades rather than in a single decade. So slower growth in population. Biggest growth in the population over the age of 70, the net increase of about 189,000 residents over the age of 70. So that's accounting for a substantial share of net population growth over that 30-year period. Basically, no growth of the sort of school-age population under the age of 20, increase of just about 1% or less than 1%. So, so not a big increase in school-age population. And part of this is driven by a decline in the 20 to 29-year-olds as millennials age. And so we're seeing fewer folks who are going to be at that age group kind of forming households, and the households that do exist will probably be a little bit older, and we'll get into that shortly. All of this, I provide all of this because it's important context for understanding the types of households that are going to be forming in the region and the location where those households might want to live. So if we do look at households across this area, we expect that the population grows by about 10% over those 30 years. We expect households to grow by about 155,000 or just under 12%. We'll actually see a decline in the number of households headed by somebody under the age of 35. Again, that's as the millennials kind of age from, you know, their 20s and maybe early 30s into their 30s and 40s over that period, and especially over the next decade or two. Big increases in the over 65 households driven by that big population growth there, and also increases in those that are 35 to 54. If we look at the types of households that are forming, the biggest growth by far is single person households. It's about half of the total are going to be people living alone. That's a combination of new folks who are forming households and living on their own, as well as older folks who are, maybe their kid moves out and they live by themselves, or they get divorced, or their spouse or partner passes away. So a big increase in those single person households, about 35,000 additional households with children. So that's the smallest share of the total, but still significant. But what's important to note about those is those are going to be parents that are somewhat older, so 35 and over. Generally are going to kind of have higher incomes in earning, and also tend to have smaller families. So many of these families will be only 1 to 2 kids. And so we're going to see some growth of households, but again, even though there's household growth, the number of children under the age of 20 remains about the same, because these are going to be smaller households. And then overall, about almost, I guess 59% of the net growth is households earning under $75,000 a year. That's a combination of people of low-income households forming with young folks who aren't earning very much, as well as seniors aging into retirement where they have a fixed income and are getting less than they were when they were working. So in terms of jobs, the region is projected to gain about 60,000 jobs each decade, roughly over the 30-year period. So that's about 187,000 jobs total. Again, these are projections that are developed by UMass Donahue Institute, informed by our labor force projections, but also informed by Bureau of Labor Force forecasts about industry change and occupational change moving forward. Fastest growing sectors are the ones up at the top of the list there. Information, education, and health services is a big one because it's a huge sector in this region and also is growing fairly rapidly at 27%. And then professional and business services. And we see big declines in leisure and hospitality, as well as manufacturing. And so again, those are going to have big implications for where jobs are being created and lost over this period. So we have some regional numbers about households, population, jobs. How do we allocate that within the region? Where do we think that growth is going to occur? Where do we think some decline might occur? As we've discussed before, we're using a tool called UrbanSim to do that. So that's a land use allocation model that's been adopted by dozens of MPOs across the country. We're working with UrbanSim as a consultant to do this. Been a project underway for a few years. It's a tool that accounts for all the things listed here related to development preferences, zoning regulations, and things like that. And one important thing to remember is that households and jobs in UrbanSim are allocated from regional control totals all the way down to the census block. So moving forward, we can update this model when time comes to do project-specific forecasts. For a MIPA review or for a big transportation project, we can adjust the projections with the most up-to-date, development pipeline and things like that. And that may cause some changes in the municipal control totals throughout the region. So we're not maintaining and fixing those regional control totals in the same way that we did before. The LRTP forecasts will remain as they are when they're adopted in the LRTP, but moving forward, there may also be some adjustments as we need to do project work or environmental review work. So a key input on this is MassBuild's, MAPC's collaborative development inventory. In January, we reached out to municipalities and asked them to provide updates. We've got a great response. Over 450 MassBuild's records have been updated in the last just in the last 4 months, and that includes also a couple hundred that were updated last year. So currently contains information about over 4,500 developments in the region, almost 6,000 developments statewide. Looking over the 10 years between 2010 and 2020, about 80% of the housing unit growth that was counted in the census is reflected in mass builds. So we're, it is not quite comprehensive, but it's getting pretty close in terms of all the units that were added over that period. And looking forward, we've got about 1,700 developments that are completed 2020 and afterwards, totaling about 135,000 housing units and 170 million square feet of commercial space. So a lot of development that's in the pipeline that's anticipated that we hear about from municipalities. Maybe not all that is going to be realized, but all of it is going to be needed to help inform where the allocation of growth will go. If you'd like to see it, you can check it out at massbuilds.com. So along with mass builds, along with zoning information and models about location choice preferences, the model starts in 2010. We actually start forecasting in 2010 and try to hit what we know about 2020 from what little census data are available. And if you'll recall, we still have very limited information from the 2020 census. All we have is total households, total housing units, population over and under 18 at the municipal and census block level. We don't really have any other information about the types of families, the age of householders, or anything like that. So we do forecast out to 2020 and then beyond. And so we're trying to get that to match municipal totals for households in 2020 and then carry on from there. So overall, when we look at the variance at the municipal level in terms of how many households were allocated versus how many were counted in census, the absolute variance, so plus or minus, averages about 2.3% of households in 2020 at the municipal level. So I think we're getting pretty good, fairly reasonable alignment there. And we're going to continue to adjust that with a few tweaks for municipalities where we're seeing a big difference. And then we can also look at that by community type. As folks know, MAPC has 7 community types for the entire region. And this chart here shows in the blue is the census household change. So the number of households that were measured between the increase or change between the 2 decennial censuses. And then the orange is the urban sim household allocation for those community types over that same 10-year period. So I think we're getting a reasonably good correlation between census household growth and urban sim growth. A little bit extra allocation to the metro core communities, which is Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, Chelsea, Everett, Revere, and maybe a little bit less going to subregional urban centers and maturing suburbs. But generally speaking, looking very good. And these patterns of allocation to different household types actually continue moving forward. So moving forward, the metro core communities will continue to under our projections, that this particular draft continue to capture a very significant share of household growth, rising to maybe 2/3 or not quite 2/3 of household growth in the 2030 to 2040, and then they kind of drop off after that. And the housing pipeline is a really big factor in that. So 65% of mass builds housing unit projects or housing units are in the metro core. And so when we have that much information about development that's already planned, it's a good indicator of where it's likely to occur, and therefore where households will have some opportunity to find new units. Again, it's important to remember these projections don't account for new opportunities that are going to be created through MBTA communities rezoning. Later on, we'll see, Lexington has very slow population growth, however, or slow household growth moving forward. But as we just heard, they have adopted a very aggressive MBTA communities bylaw with multifamily zoning by right. That could actually change those patterns, and we'll be incorporating that moving forward. It won't be in this particular LRTP forecast, but we will try to incorporate all this MBTA communities rezoning moving forward. But that is an important caveat of these projections. In terms of employment projections by community type, the metro core encompasses almost all net new jobs over this time period, about 193,000 jobs in the metro core. That's driven by 2 main reasons. One is the amount of development that's already in the pipeline in terms of lab space and educational space in the inner core is very substantial. And then the second is that the fastest growing sectors, so as I mentioned, information, education, health, and so forth, most of those are already concentrated in the core. And the declining sectors, leisure and hospitality, and manufacturing tend to be more distributed throughout the region. So we don't exactly know where those jobs are going to be lost, and so those losses will be observed throughout the region and will tend to correspond to where the densities of those contracting sectors are right now. And as we'll see, those are spread out throughout the region. So this is the current job growth by, the projected job growth by community type over that 30-year period. So what does it look like when we put some of this on a map? This is the total projected household growth over the 30-year period. The biggest numbers, of course, in Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, Quincy in the inner core. But you can see that even out in some suburban municipalities, we're seeing demand for 1,500, 2,000 units. So really a lot of growth spread throughout the core, even if, in total terms. And then in percentage terms, you can see, the percentage growth in Boston and the other metro core communities is still high, but more on par with the rest of the region. If we look at population growth, and this again is in percent terms, you see that there's quite a few municipalities that have very slow population growth. These are aging communities, not adding a lot of households. And so those are the ones that are in the lightest color there, where population growth may be less than 2.5%. In some cases, it could even be negative with extremely slow growing communities as seniors age and younger families aren't moving into the community. You'll see sort of fewer and fewer people per household, which could contribute to population declines in some of those communities. Workers are this is really important for travel demand modeling, because where workers are is where home-based work trips are generated. So you can see the distribution. This is the percent change in workers. And again, like households, sort of fairly well distributed throughout the region, although quite a few communities with very slow growth in the number of workers in some suburban areas. And then finally, projected job change. As I mentioned, the majority of job change is captured by those metro core communities. This is percent increase here. And you can see that for all of those communities that are in one of those shades of orange, they could see 2.5%, maybe up to 5% decline. In some cases, up to 10% decline in jobs moving forward, as they lose leisure and hospitality, manufacturing jobs that aren't, and there's no corresponding job growth in some of those growing sectors. Finally, we've talked about households a lot here, and I know folks, working in cities and towns, folks at the state level are really interested in this question of, well, how many housing units do we need? It's not just a matter of households, but also the number of units we need is really unit demand is a function of two things. One is how many households might be added over a given time period, plus how many additional units are needed to achieve and maintain a healthy vacancy rate. One of the reasons that the housing crisis, it was both a symptom and a sort of cause of the region's housing crisis, is the low vacancy rate. And when that happens, renters and buyers have to compete for a very limited number of existing units, allowing landlords and sellers to mark up the price and sell it to the highest bidder. And so achieving healthy vacancy rates of somewhere in the range of 4.5% to 5% can help to create some slack in the market and allow renters and would-be buyers to have more choice of units and to be able to shop around for one they can afford, and landlords and sellers will have a little less power in the market. So we looked at what's the existing shortage if we're trying to achieve one of those target vacancy rates on the slide. How many additional households will be needed? How many additional vacant units will be needed to maintain those target vacancy rates? And then you can see from that we calculate the total housing unit demand on the right side there. So about 155,000 households likely to be added over that 30-year time period. We'll need about at least 187,000 housing units. I'll just reiterate, this is a floor, not a ceiling. As if we see more, faster population growth, if we see people forming additional households because now there's a little more slack in the housing supply, or if we see greater international immigration, it's likely that we may need even more than that. So I think 187,000 units over this 30-year period is really a bare minimum. And we can certainly aim for more than that, and we'll be working on some other numbers to support that right now or shortly. So why don't I will stop sharing now and be happy to take any questions that folks have.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, how to do that.
David Kozis.
Yeah, this presentation is always so interesting to me, Tim. I'm just going to ask one question because I'm just kind of curious. So we're seeing continued growth of assisted living, nursing homes, independent living, just more and more of these facilities being built as the need keeps going up. And I guess it's the same for college dorms, but I'm just wondering, how are these classified? Are each of these rooms in a building like that? Are they each a housing unit, or is it a household, or are they living alone, or are they 2+ adults or something?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very complicated topic, and I think there's one of the big uncertainties about the future is the extent to which those tomorrow's seniors are using assisted living in nursing homes. To answer the question, I guess first is there's a distinction between group quarters and housing units. Group quarters is anywhere where a person doesn't have their own kitchen facilities, their own bath facilities, really a sort of self-contained unit. So a nursing home and a dorm, as well as jails and prisons and so forth, would all count as group quarters. We separate out group quarters resident. UMDI produces total population, and then we make an estimate of the share of the population that's going to be in group quarters. For seniors, we assume it'll be a percentage of the residents of a given age. So I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but let's say it's 15% of folks who are aged 80 to 85 are in group quarters. We assume that percentage will continue moving forward. So some of that housing, that population growth that UMass Donahue is projecting, a portion of that is also, there's another portion that I didn't even show, which is like going into group quarters. So there will be continuing demand for those kinds of group quarters, senior population. In terms of dorms, we kind of fix the dorm population as it is now. We know there's going to be some new dorms that are built, but we're unable to kind of incorporate that, and it's sort of around the edges from a regional perspective. So that's kind of how we would distinguish those types of units. So things that are, if it's assisted living or over 55, where people have their own units and they have their own kitchen facilities and so forth, those would count as a housing unit, and the residents in them would count as households, and so they would be included in all this information I showed you.
Complicated, but thank you.
Yeah.
Amira Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tim, I just want to say that was an amazing presentation. It's always super interesting to hear all the facts. The only question I really have is, does your data in regards to housing in the housing crisis take in the new housing and rent control that Mayor Wu has now put in place? Just wanted to see how that kind of relates.
Great, thank you for the compliment and a good question. We have not incorporated information about rent control here. We're really looking kind of more on the supply side, and how many households are likely to form and how the income and size of those households will be changing. I think the rent control is obviously an incredibly important topic and merits a lot of discussion. For our purposes, I think what we would be most concerned about from a kind of forecasting and allocation perspective is, do we think that rent control would suppress the production of housing in Boston or other communities that adopt it in ways that would change the allocation of households or future growth? I think that's a fair question to ask. I think given the uncertainty about the proposal and the uncertainty about the effects of rent control and rent stabilization generally, I think it's not possible to answer that in great detail. We're going to assume that it doesn't, and that it is not going to have a big impact on new development coming in the pipeline. the way that that proposal is structured is a lot of those new developments are exempt for a certain number of years and so forth. So I think we're gonna, so that we assume that that doesn't have a material impact on what projects get produced and delivered. But thanks for the question.
Thank you, Tim. Other questions for Tim? Seeing none. Tim, that was a great presentation as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. We'll be getting municipal level forecasts as well as some block level maps out to well, to CTPS staff very shortly, and also back out to the municipalities for a final look before this gets incorporated in the LRTP. So folks can keep an eye out for that. And thank you for the attention and the great questions today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim, so much. Next item on the agenda, I believe, is member items. Are there any? Seeing none. Wait, Leonard Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So sorry, we'll chime in a little late here, but I just wanted to let people know that I am very happy that I was elected to a second term for select board in Arlington. But the main reason I bring it up is I want, since Brad Rawson is here, I want to let Brad know that during my campaign, I channeled him a lot in that I really said that what we need most is to make the region great, especially when it comes to transportation issues. Each municipality will benefit more if the whole region does well. And so I like to think that the residents of Arlington heard that message and supported. So I really mean that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lennon. Congratulations. Other member items? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to adjourn? And please state your name for the record when making a motion. Eric Barassa.
Hi, Eric Barassa, motion to adjourn.
Amira Patterson.
Mayor Patterson, seconding that motion.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.